Oh, that's the good stuff. It's starting to turn into a Pavlovian response for me. It's like as soon as I hear a school bell anywhere, I just want to start talking about history.
The blood starts pumping.
Yeah, straight to my penis. I am Adam, the gentleman to my right that is going to be taking you through this incredibly groundbreaking flight. Is the animal to my hawk, the Shawn Michaels to my Marty Jannetty, and the axe to my Slash. That is Professor Chris.
What's up, everybody? Could I be the Shawn Michaels to your Triple H? I'm more familiar with the Attitude Era. And
Okay,
I feel
yeah.
like with D-Generation X,
Gone that, dude. The Rockers, though. The Rockers were somebody that I grew up with. It hit me at like the perfect time when I was young, and the streamers and the colors and the missile drop kicks off the top rope.
Was that like during the days of when like the Ultimate Warrior would wear the tassels?
Yep.
And it was that, oh, it's the Neon Era.
Yep, they had the frills that were coming off of the boots. Just the coolest.
Out of this world stuff. Yeah. Speaking of out of this world, we are talking about something that when we started doing the research on this and breaking it down into how incredible all the events that occurred for the Apollo 11 mission, the Apollo program in general, and just the entire space race. I think we're really jaded now because as much of our brains know stuff is fiction, we are visual people.
Yeah.
Spectacle is something that, like, you know, we want to be odd, and actual space is kind of boring when you compare it to all of the fictionalized space that we've just been fucking feeding into our eye holes since we've been fucking children. And so when you go back and you look at landing a man on the moon and what it took to do that, and you set yourself in that seat of trying to understand it on a realistic level, it fucking blows your mind.
Well, so much of it we just take for granted that it happened. And going through and like, we didn't get somebody onto the moon safely or efficiently. We got somebody onto the moon with the hope that everything would go just right enough with a billion other things still going wrong to achieve the mission.
Well, and when you hear, you know, if you're familiar with the Apollo 11 being the first man-landed, or however you want to say it, moon mission, you have to assume in your head that, okay, well, Apollo 11, there were 11 previous missions, what they were. I don't even know if that clicks, but then at the same time, to think that we just started launching missions and we got to the moon and landed, it made it seem so simple that it just jumped from NASA, oh, they just landed a man on the moon. It's not living through that time frame. I mean, I'm fucking jealous of what that feeling had to be like watching that whole thing develop and being like, we got a man here and we got a man up to this point, and we're just like, oh my God, we're getting closer.
It developed in the blink of an eye, though. We're talking like 11 years.
Yeah.
That to me is to do anything this fast in 11 years. In this day and age, if you build a building, buildings used to take forever back then. Mm-hmm. When you see like an NFL stadium will be built in 2 or 3 years and you just look at the magnitude, you're like, holy shit, that's gigantic.
Yeah.
That's 2 or 3 years to build a building on Earth with all your supplies here. Mm-hmm. It took them 11 years to get from Earth to the moon.
Yeah.
That's a monumental undertaking.
All right. Well, we're going to walk you through how this shit went down. But first, thank you guys for all of your continued support. You guys have been awesome with the interactions. All of our new people following us, like on Spotify or wherever you guys get your podcasts. Hope you're here to stay. Go back, listen to the back catalog. And, you know, rate, review, subscribe. I know we say that all the time, but you guys keep doing it, so we're going to keep reminding.
And go check out our sponsors. Part of the reason why we threw sponsors in and are trying to monetize this more is because if you guys even got a peek at the Rolodex of ideas that we have to do as far as adding a video element and adding just every little detail that we want to do to give you guys a visual experience of some of the places that we're talking about and to walk you through some of these battlefields and just to see the ideas that we have rolling around in our heads, we need money for it. And if we get that money for it and we start doing it, there's really no end to the content that we
want to go places. We want to go to some of these places and be able to film these things to actually like show you guys scale, talk about it, get that feeling, and kind of let you know what that evokes. And history is one thing that I think people kind of take for granted as far as having messages that can directly apply to shit that's going on nowadays. So, plus we just want to have fun.
Yeah,
It sounds fun as shit.
and something that's would be exciting to do, but an exciting watch. Something to bring content to people that they can enjoy.
You're excited
wholesome.
about the food.
Yeah.
That would be a segment in
Yeah.
it, having to try traditional, like, fare from that region, everything. That would be your thing. You would have to do that, and then I would have to do any type of, like, weird stunt shit.
Oh no, I'm in for the stunts. I'm not eating guinea pig though.
You're jumping out of a sea.
No, on the ground.
Okay.
Anything on the ground.
There might be air-related stunts. I'll go ahead and take that.
Take those, yeah.
All right, guys. We're getting into Apollo 11. All right. How did this thing get started, Adam?
Well, we can't start out with Apollo because Apollo was kind of the crown jewel on top of the
Space program.
Yeah, we had the run up where in 1958, NASA was kind of like a special group that had to be separated from the Air Force so they could focus on this because it was too big. Project Mercury was kind of the first idea of this foundation, and it started the same year that NASA was formed in 1958. They took the project over from the Air Force. And over the life of Mercury, it conducted 20 unmanned flights and 6 successful flights by astronauts. The first successful launch was the Explorer 1 satellite, and that was launched in the same year, 1958. So we're already getting shit in the air. 1958, we're already sending satellites up. There's already a little proof of concept to what we have going on.
And the space race kicks off almost immediately. This was almost it wasn't a kickoff to the Cold War, but this is kind of the first visual battle of the Cold War because all the clandestine shit no one really knew about.
It was a test off the battlefield.
Exactly. It was who to see was the more technically superior country. And so you have the Russians who end up launching the first, basically getting a satellite into orbit with Sputnik. All Sputnik did was it sent back a constant radio beep, but it was detectable, so we knew that it was up in space.
Yeah.
But they were the first to actually develop a rocket powerful enough with the technology enough to get it up to this, the into orbit and to launch it and to maintain orbit. They end up beating us there. And so the space race is the intention is to keep escalating. You got a satellite up, we're going to get the first fucking man up. They're like, well, we're already working on it.
We're going to tell a very NASA-sided, NASA-centric part of the space race today. And kind of save the blow-by-blow and back and forth for probably a Cold War episode just because the space race is endlessly interesting, but the race is almost secondary to what's going on within the country. So we get Explorer 1 up after Sputnik. May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard becomes the first astronaut that's launched into a suborbital flight.
First American astronaut.
Yuri...
I can't remember his last name. Yuri something.
Was a Ruski that got put into space first, and this was a very big slap in the face to the United States. This was kind of like the kick in the pants that they needed.
We're down 2-0.
Yeah.
At this point, they got the first satellite. Now they got the first man. Where do you go from here?
And
2 men.
Yeah.
So you got to get 2 men up there.
1 man and a dog.
Yes. Enter Project Gemini, the Gemini project. So it went Mercury, basically being able to get unmanned stuff up there, and then finally an astronaut. We're going to get 2 guys up here. So, of course, you're going to choose Gemini. It's the astrological sign for, like, twins or some shit, right?
I have no idea.
All I think of is Gemini's twin. I don't know if that was a fictional group or something like that. 2 astronauts. America was first to do this.
Well, we were also the first during Mercury, February 20th, 1962. John Glenn made 3 full orbits around the Earth. He was the first person to ever orbit the Earth.
Yuri actually orbited 1 time. I think
Was it 1?
Yeah.
I thought he didn't.
I'll look it up.
Okay. And like you say, it laid the groundwork for what happens in Project Gemini. It was ended in 1963 just because Gemini had the legs so far. Project Gemini, its origins start kind of around 1961. The first flight was Gemini 1. That happened April 8th, 1964. So the speed at which we're building rockets in these things just is so fast.
Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union, first human in space. The Vostok 1 circled the Earth at a speed of 27,000 kilometers per hour, with the flight lasting 108 minutes. So he did go around.
Okay, so why was John Glenn so big? Because he was a United States guy?
He was the first American to go around,
Okay.
I think, or something like that. Because Alan Shepard, his didn't last very long. He didn't
just
orbit. He was
popped
up
up.
for like 15 minutes
Yeah.
and then came down.
Okay. So John Glenn, Les Shine, 3 full orbits, pretty cool. The uncrewed objectives were to test all of the structure integrity of the new spacecrafts that were being introduced. And also, this is something that just never really thought about. Just always thought about how important everything was within it, but it also helped train the ground crews.
Yeah.
Because the ground crews are just as important to make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted.
I think more so.
You think it's more?
I think it's got to be 70 to 80% of the engineers, ground crew, all those guys, and 30%, 20 or 30% astronauts, because those
You're
guys,
including mission control into the ground crew?
yes,
Okay.
those guys, they're operating everything, they're taking the risk. So I'm not trying to diminish their participation in it, but everything in order to fulfill their mission and stay alive is contingent on those guys building everything to the utmost just quality.
And making sure that the setup is that nothing gets damaged.
Having the
on launch.
rocket thrust the same. You know, those pilots aren't responsible with these burns and everything that these rockets go through. They're all predetermined. So yeah, I think it's definitely the ground crew and everyone that's actually in the factories and assembly areas that are more critical.
Yeah, it tested all of the tracking and communication systems that were aboard these spacecrafts, which is also huge too, because you can't be losing things that are up in space.
So with these spacecrafts that were launched, I don't know how familiar one is with early space travel, but so first of all, they were basically the tip of the rocket, and it was just a little. I'm trying to think of a cone that was on the rocket.
Yeah.
And it was room enough for originally one guy to sit in there cramped, and he had controls for once the rocket took him to a certain, altitude above Earth, it would then detach. He would then get into an orbit pattern, but he didn't have like huge rockets on his little thing. It was just control thrusters to get him into position to go around the Earth in its gravity, and then also put himself in for reentry. So these were very, very small. It's going to continue for the Apollo program, but the actual area that these guys were in is insanely small.
Yeah, it's like they're playing Nintendo. They have a D-pad and they have an A and a B button, and that's really all they have up there.
Yeah. And so with this, along with the Gemini mission, you're getting larger capsules because you're now having to have 2 astronauts that are working together. You also start to test out spacesuits. So Gemini also included the first, what they considered spacewalk. And this is basically how it went down. Inside the capsule, they're already in their spacesuits. They're basically just in their seats. When they get up into orbit, it is as simple as reaching up, and it's like a DeLorean door, except it goes in the other direction. They would just unlock the airlock, swing the door open above them, and crawl out of their seat. One of the guys in the program, I can't remember which Gemini mission it was, he got out, and while he was out, because of the colder air and all that kind of stuff, his suit pressure expanded, and he couldn't get back in. He was too big to get back in, so he had to cut the suit and relieve the pressure in order to get back in and then seal it.
Oh my god!
Also, a fun fact with the Gemini mission is if you're watching the first spacewalk, you see a glove float out of the Gemini, a loose glove that he had laying around. They have the other glove back at Houston at the Johnson Space Center.
So its mates just floating in space.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just from the ground crews and everything, this is where the astronauts were trained using these Gemini missions for the upcoming Apollo project. And that just aimed at landing on the moon. It was a promise that JFK had made to, I think, Congress in 1961. He had made kind of a public promise during a commencement speech that he made in 1962. And this is we will land a man on the moon.
This was May 24th or 25th of 61, 20 days after Freedom 7 and Alan Shepard became the first American in space. That's when Kennedy made the moon speech. He had no idea. All he saw was that we got a man in space, and he's like, oh, okay, so before 1970, it should be totally feasible to get a man on the moon. So I'm going to give you guys less than 9 years to get this thing taken care of.
Well, to be fair, he also thought that he would be able to see this happen, too.
That's true, yeah. Only lasted a couple years after that. Also, with the Gemini program, all of this is ramping up just to try to get further and further out. They're testing docking, so basically they have to have a way in order to have two spaceships come together, transport, fuel or do anything like that, and then also to test the reentry process. So how the reentry process worked is you got up to space, you're in this cone, the bottom of it where your back is actually sitting, you're facing the narrower part of the cone. But the back of it, you actually lean back, and that's where you're coming back into the Earth's atmosphere. You're coming in, astronauts are coming in backwards. And that's where the heat shield is. Yeah. So they were testing all of the different methods for reentry, making sure the heat shields, because, every time it comes in and everyone survives, they're looking for damage, they're looking for what they can improve on. Finally comes to the big project, Apollo.
Yeah, before we do Apollo, just a quick rundown of how Gemini all went. Parameters were tested for mission endurance up to just under 14 days. A traditional trip to the moon would be 8 days, and we'll talk about kind of the pattern that is later. All launches came from Cape Kennedy Air Force Complex in Florida. Gemini 3 was Gus Grisham and a guy whose last name is Young that we'll talk about later. They were the first crewed mission to use thrusters to change its orbit, and this was March 23rd, 1965. This was Gemini 3. Don't know what happened. Gemini 1 and 2 must have not been manned or something like that. Gemini 4, a guy named Ed White, performs the first spacewalk that you were talking about, June 3rd, 1965. Gemini 5 was the first use of fuel cells to generate electrical power.
Do you want to hear something funny about the spacewalk thing?
Yeah.
So the mission commander would never be the one to do the spacewalk.
Really?
Yeah. Because at some point, okay, so how the astronaut selection process worked is... when you were on the crew, you had your backup crew that could fill in for either person or both if necessary. If you were the backup crew, that meant that you were going to be the main crew 3 missions later, 2 or 3 missions later. So people that served as the backup crew for, let's just use a number, Gemini 4 would then be the main crew for Gemini 7, I believe. So you were just kind of paying your dues at that point, and then... it was kind of a rotating pool. I mean, people went up I think people went up usually like 2 times, one with each program.
Well, and we'll talk about I think there were 3 classes of astronauts that were chosen as far as like the pool that they took from. And it was kind of just like you were a part of that graduating class and you were sort of a team, but they would pair you up with the other groupings of astronauts that were brought in. It just kind of like as you could fit together.
Because people also had different roles. It wasn't just like the term astronaut is just such a broad term. It's not like, oh, the astronauts, they can just do everything. So you have astronauts that can pilot and do, if they can pilot, they do everything else. You have specially trained. You have people that are piloting certain crafts, and that's all they do on the mission. Yeah. Some people are brought along just to pilot for a short portion of the mission. Some people are brought along as the mission commanders to not do anything except have the final say and command the overall mission. Well, so you can get a mixing of people in there depending on who might have to drop out or, who they decide to pair together because they think it's a functional group. There has to be some type of working relationship there.
And along with that, it's just kind of the idea that some of these astronauts, the 3 that go on to Apollo 11, not some of, because there's only 3 of them, but they were involved in big Gemini things. So like Gemini 6 was the first rendezvous with the sister craft. Gemini 7, that was a 14-day endurance flight. So you have these rendezvous that are starting to come in where they're starting to actually send one up, let it sit there, send the other one up.
How fucking crazy is that? We were born at a time when space shuttle launches were very few and far between, even more far between after Challenger.
Oh, yeah.
This is a time when NASA is literally launching rockets within 2 weeks of each other just to test shit out.
It's just so fast.
It would be so fucking cool to have lived around Cape Canaveral and just be like, walk out your back door and be able to see, from a distance, oh, they're launching another rocket.
the first ones wouldn't be fun because they've talked about like the shock waves that come off of the testing, like blowing
Yeah.
out glass in houses that were so far away and all that. So maybe once they got suppression figured out, it'd be pretty
Once they
sweet.
determined the distance and bought up that property and had to relocate people.
And then they bring in a new rocket that has higher propulsion and it just blows out
Well,
further.
that was the whole thing during this entire process is these rockets were designed to only be able to take up a certain amount of weight. If you need to go to the moon, you can't just go up in one of these little capsules. You have to have actual propulsion to get to the moon. So back at the Jet Propulsion Development Center, which was in Huntsville.
Yeah, in Alabama.
Yeah, so in July 1960, when, all of this is getting kicked off, even before Freedom 7, you get the Marshall Space Flight Center, which is in Huntsville, and this is where all of the development of the launch boosters
And where all the Nazis are.
this is where all of the Nazis live, exactly. This is where Werner von Braun is. This is where his other two people that are tied to the SS. One of the guys' names is, Kurt de Bus, not a very German-sounding name. And then there was a third guy, I can't recall his name, but they were basically in charge of the propulsion system for these rockets. You had them develop certain propulsion systems for the Mercury mission, then larger ones to get the larger capsule on the Gemini mission. The goal here is you're going to have to launch something much heavier than this, and this is where they developed the Saturn rocket.
And Gemini is still pre-Saturn. It's still actually like quite a few iterations away. Gemini 8 achieved the first space docking with an unmanned target craft. Gemini 10, this is going to be a name we want to remember. Michael Collins becomes the first person to meet another spacecraft in orbit. So he probably has some qualities that you would probably want to put on a mission that you're headed to the moon, considering that he was the first guy to do something like this.
Maybe a couple.
And to go along with this whole entire story, we're talking about a time when computers weren't really a thing. So what NASA had done to figure out a lot of these like launch angles and speeds and orbits and trajectories and everything like that, pre-computers, was they were doing these big, long calculations that they had to figure out kind of on their own accord.
Fucking calculators.
Yeah,
Calculators
well,
and fucking and compasses and Pythagorean theorem and all of it just being done by the human fucking brain about launch angles, thrust capacity, how much weight to thrust ratio to get this rocket to break orbit if it weighs this much, what kind of fuels are the most combustible.
Not only that, all of the chemical engineering and all of that kind of stuff is mostly handled by the men. Doing all this math and everything kind of became a hindrance on them doing other things.
Making stuff that goes boom.
Yeah. So what NASA did was they actually went out and found women that had mathematics degrees, different things like that, to come in and run all of these complex math problems to figure out trajectory and all this kind of stuff. And these women were sitting there with just massive, big math problems that they would break up. They would end up solving their own. They would put it all together. I'm assuming that the tie-in really with Huntsville too. And these are people that I think they did that Invisible... Was it like Invisible Women, the NASA thing that was talking about the...
Yeah, it was something like that.
Hidden
about
Figures, something like that. Mm-hmm. But African-American women that were working in Huntsville with this propulsion center to figure out these big mathematical problems and with NASA that we really don't hear about because you don't really... In this day and age, I don't think back to a time when computers weren't readily available. And these complex math problems had to be solved somehow, and they were just doing them in their heads and by hand, which blows me away that they could figure this stuff out, because if I'm wrong on a math test, I just get a point taken off. If these women are wrong on their mathematics, somebody dies, and it's a lot of money.
A fraction of a degree in a thruster burn or travel, when you're traveling the kind of distances it takes to go to the fucking moon and everything, just fractions of little degrees that you're off course can burn too much fuel with your corrections and all that kind of stuff, and they're dead.
Yeah. So the numbers game is so important to how they got all of this figured out. Gemini 11 set the Earth orbital altitude record of 739 nautical miles.
It's so weird that we use nautical miles
space.
for up.
I'm telling you, man, this is all my theory. all space travel is just on the water. We just stole all of the terms for everything that happened on the water and we took it into flight.
It's just the intergalactic ocean.
Pretty much. Well, and even the Wright brothers, I mean, they were using all sorts of different terms from a boat for their,
that's true.
their first airplanes. That happens in 1966. Gemini 12, another name that's going to be pretty important, Edwin Buzz Aldrin becomes the first astronaut to prove work could be done outside on these EVA walks without deadly exhaustion. This is November 66.
This is where we also get the advent of power tools, ladies and gentlemen. In case you didn't know this, power tools only exist because they were developed by NASA for astronauts needing to do things in space, which is why we have battery-operated power tools.
Holy shit. That is cool. We're using space technology every time we drill something with a battery-powered drill. Sweet. The Apollo program improved on Gemini's testing. They switched over from the Titan II rocket to the Saturn V rocket. There were 3 other test launch vehicles that were used in between. Test launch is just basically a fancy word for a rocket. This ran from 1961 to 72. So they kept improving, and 72 is obviously way past. But once we hit the Saturn V, that was like the kitty's titties. That was the one that we knew that was going to continue to get us to where we needed to go. Just to start out on Apollo, the Apollo 1 launch, pretty big deal that I really had no idea about. There was a disaster where there was a cabin fire during a launch rehearsal that was 3 weeks prior to the actual launch. And basically what happened was there was sparking between wires, and they had used nylon to kind of hold everything down. Nylon is extremely flammable. The other very big issue was they were pumping straight oxygen into the cockpit, and straight oxygen, if you don't know, is extremely flammable. The other issue was the airlock to get in and out of the cabin that they were in. Instead of being able to just push out from their angle, it was to push in.
It swung in. Yeah.
But all of the atmospheric pressure that was going on inside the cabin...
It's sealed.
Yeah, it basically made it so you couldn't get that door open to get them out. All 3 of them were incinerated and killed. And that was Gus Grisham, the guy that was the first Gemini 3. There was another man, Ed White, that we had talked about that was on there, and a guy named Robert Chaffee. It was originally named the AS-204. They decided to name it Apollo 1, kind of in memory of the actual Apollo program, that this was the first chance. This is so important to me because just the amount of time that happens. This was January 27th, 1967.
Yeah, we're already into 67. With these guys training, you have missions like, Apollo 1, Apollo 2, Apollo 3. All of these are training concurrently. It's not like we're going to get done with Apollo 1, then we're going to pick the next astronauts and the next date for launch for Apollo 2. This thing is laid out like the fucking Disney lineup for New Marvel and fucking Disney. All of them concurrently going at the same time. So while Apollo 1 is getting ready to launch, they're already 3/4 of the way through building the rocket, the capsule, all that stuff, if not even more so for Apollo 2. They're just waiting to get information back from Apollo 1 that says, tweak this, tweak this, tweak this, do this differently, and they can make those changes. They don't have to make changes to the booster, the rocket. It's just about the actual vehicle that the guys are riding on. Quick thing about the Saturn V rocket, just because it's fucking badass, even though it was designed by a Nazi. It's a 3-stage rocket. So basically, and I'm holding up a tiny little one in front of me because I got it from the Johnson Space Center.
It's not about the size of the rocket, it's about how you use it.
That's true. So it's a 3-stage rocket. So the first part is what initially fires off, that provides the bulk of the thrust to get it up and start breaking gravity and get it up to speed. And
before you continue, if you haven't seen a video of this takeoff, you gotta do it.
In some type of movies or anything, it's the video that you see where the arms are swinging off the rocket and all of the dry, it looks like dry ice is coming off it. All of the moisture and everything is cracking off the rocket as it launches.
And it's the slowest process that you could ever imagine.
What makes me feel weird about this is I know that it's, meticulously designed, but it only has fins and rudders at the very back of it. And when it first starts, it's not going fast enough to have any type of aerodynamic change of direction. So it starts out and the rockets start going and it just rises slowly and then starts gaining speed. But every time I'm just waiting for that thing to fucking start tilting and tipping over and then doing the fucking loop-de-loop into the ground. So it's a 3-stage rocket. So the first booster takes it up to a certain altitude. Once it starts getting up higher into the atmosphere, after that burns all of the fuel inside it. It actually breaks off, and then a metal cuff also breaks off, and you have the second stage rocket where you have that metal cuff covering the actual like exhaust nozzles. That rocket then kicks in immediately and fires it further into the atmosphere until it burns out all of its fuel. It does the same thing where it breaks apart or breaks off of it. Metal ring breaks off, and you now have the third stage. And the third stage is the final stage that gets him up into orbit. And with the Apollo mission, what it's carrying up into orbit is completely different than what it was carrying up before, because now you're planning for an actual journey to the moon.
Yeah. So you're going to have a lot more.
One thing, too, just to go back a little bit, I'm sorry I keep adding this shit in.
No, you're good. This is all so fascinating to me.
The space,
you actually got to see this stuff, which is so cool.
It was fucking so cool. Walking past the Saturn rocket and seeing it in its different stages, but just standing next and seeing the size of it. If you're looking at it, if you ever pull up an image of it, just also look at the very tip top where like the antenna sticks out, and then look right below that. That is the crew compartment. That's how tiny those 3 guys are sitting, and they're just sitting with their back to nothing but a giant fucking bomb that's directed out the back of it. It's fucking nuts. The fucking balls on these guys is insane. So the space race is what basically kicked off NASA, and with this Apollo program, because it was so ambitious, it required so many more resources that this is where you actually get the development, like I said, of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. September 61 is when you get the Johnson Space Center that is in Houston. So the difference between everything used to be run out of Cape Canaveral, where they launched the rockets. They would communicate with the astronauts there, and then the splashdown would take place. I can't remember in which ocean, but everything was kind of contained to Cape Canaveral. When the Apollo mission started, it was such a huge mission. At its peak, man, it had 400,000 employees and cost a total of $25 billion at that time.
That had to have been one of the biggest governmental agencies around, right? If not the biggest at that time?
It had the most eyes on it. So it's getting so big that you need to have a dedicated mission control center. So Cape Canaveral becomes just launch. Once that thing's up in the air and launches, they pass it over to Houston. This is why you get the famous thing with Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem, because despite not being the place where they launched the rockets, it's actually where the manned spacecraft center is, which is then actually named after Lyndon B. Johnson, so it's the Johnson Space Center.
Oh, so this was named post.
Correct, because remember, Kennedy and Johnson, he was Kennedy's vice president, so they kind of had the most visibility in trying to get this done. Apparently, Kennedy didn't really pay a lot of attention to this. He just knew what he wanted to accomplish, and he made Johnson his liaison, so Johnson was kind of the hands-on guy.
Well, he knows about big rockets.
And then after Kennedy is shot, then the area in Florida is named the Kennedy Space Center.
Ah, okay.
So also in order, and funny thing about that guy, Kurt DeBus, that was the former SS V-2 rocket guy, he was the guy that actually designed and helped oversee the construction of the Kennedy Space Center and was its first director. So fun fucking fact. Operation Paperclip. Go back and listen to that episode, guys. It was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I got rolled with an iron fist.
So that's essentially all of the resources being pulled in here are developing all these places that are still in use today. All of this came out of really the push for the Apollo program.
Well, and just the financial responsibility that you were just talking about of how much money all this stuff cost was money that they'd carved out of the budget to do this, and it was such just a large chunk. I'm not sure that couldn't have been used better elsewhere, but at the same time, this is the biggest flex that any country could have at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I think we could probably use that money to maybe make some things a little bit better in our country at that time,
but hey,
even though it was pretty good.
Wouldn't have a flag on the moon.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have beat communism. So after this explosion happened, all of the crewed Apollo flights were suspended for 20 months to investigate. the investigation's kind of interesting that they went into and found out that a lot of like the manufacturing wasn't really up to snuff.
One of the can't remember which astronaut it was that said it. They had a quote from him, and the quote is also then redone in fucking Armageddon by Steve Buscemi.
Is it?
They're sitting in the space shuttle, and he's like, "How does it feel to be sitting on a machine that has over 2 million moving parts, all designed by the lowest bidder?" And that's kind of what the feeling was. Is they looked through Apollo 1, they're like, fuck, because it was a congressional hearing.
Yeah.
All of this investigation had to happen on it, and it was determined by, inferior processes and materials. They decided to make changes like using a mixture of oxygen and then something else, nitrogen gas and so they immediately they changed the door to actually swing outward for escapes. They actually had it designed as well that if something happened on the launch pad and the booster started to blow up, there was a method in which the cone would be fired off the top of it, and it had a parachute, and it would deploy the parachute.
It's like popping the top off of a bottle that's about to explode.
Champagne, basically fire it off as far as you can. With the Apollo missions, because they did have to go an insane amount of distance at that time, further than anyone could fathom traveling, they had to determine what type of mission would actually be successful at doing it. They kicked around a couple ideas. The mission type options were called a direct ascent. Direct ascent would basically be, we're going to send one ship that's equipped with everything. The one ship is going to go into space. It's going to go all the way to the moon. It's going to land all as one ship. It's going to take off from the moon, and that ship is then going to come back. We have Earth orbit rendezvous. We build a ship in orbit. We make a bunch of tiny little launches. We build a bigger ship. Everything, gets done over the course of a few months, that's how we do it. We have the lunar surface rendezvous. We send an unmanned mission to the moon. We send it with gas, basically fuel. We then send the manned mission there. It gets there. We have to take less resources there, so we don't have to develop as much, smaller rocket being sent there. When they get there, they'll land again kind of as the direct ascent unit, refuel, do their exploring, and then book it back to Earth. And then the final one was the lunar orbit rendezvous. This ended up being the one that wins out. So this was launched, and it was the 3 parts that were launched by the Saturn rocket. The very, very tip top of it, tipped it over, you have what's called the command module. It's just that little cone at the top. This thing, as far as the cubic feet in the command module, I think the command module had something in the neighborhood of like 200 and... It was less than 200 square feet. For fitting 3 guys, the insane control panel that when you look at it, it gives you anxiety because there's so much shit there. Their water, it wasn't attached when you look at the actual command, but it's called the command and service module. So the command module is the little cone that sits on it. The entire back portion, when it stops tapering for that cone, is fuel for the rocket behind it to propel it to the moon. And all of like the thruster systems to control it, you can't get back there because the heat shield is there separating it. So you're still, for those 11 or 14 days that it takes for the mission to get to the moon, you're just in this tiny little thing. So that's what's at the very top of it. Behind it for the Apollo mission is with this lunar orbit rendezvous, you take a second ship with you. You take that to the moon, you detach it, it goes down to the moon's surface, does its astronaut shit, it then launches back up, connects back with the command service module, astronauts crawl through it, unload all their moon rocks, all the shit that they had, get back inside, then they ditch the lunar module because they're not going to be taking the dead weight back. They turn the thing around, they use the rockets to come back to Earth. As they're nearing Earth, they detach the command module from the service module, which is basically the engine, and they position it into Earth, the atmosphere, and that's all that comes down.
It's the biggest reverse Russian nesting doll that you could ever imagine. Actually, I guess it's a traditional Russian nesting doll, right?
Yeah, kind of, in a way. What's nuts is when you're looking at, the ship and everything, in a perspective of thinking of weight, how they got it up there, when you look at the lunar module, because it's covered with that gold foil stuff, you're like, that thing is paper fucking thin. Like, how does that thing even work? Well, it doesn't work on Earth.
Yeah.
It was the first solely designed spaceship. It could only operate in low gravity or zero gravity. That's why it looks all spindly and like you could actually punch through the fucking thing. It was never designed and it couldn't even operate on Earth itself.
There was a point in time where, before they were getting out, this is fast forwarding a little bit, to where the door was sort of jammed because of the landing and how hard it was. So they were actually able to bend the door so they could get it open.
Too, because then they couldn't repressurize it if they bent it too much.
Yeah.
So with the command module and the service module, those together were 63,000 pounds.
That's a lot of weight.
That's a lot of weight, but it also makes you kind of feel better about it because you're like, okay, that's not all fucking paper thin. That's got some heft to it. Well, most of the heft was the like 2,000-pound heat shield, and then all the fucking fuel that was for the rocket and that rocket engine.
Fuel's a lot of weight.
The lunar module that would actually detach, it's the one with the spindly legs that everyone's familiar with that actually lands on the moon, and it's got the weird
covered in the gold foil
geometric shape up on top.
Uh-huh.
When it would take off from the moon, that whole thing didn't go. Only the top portion. The legs acted as a launch pad, and another engine kicked in that would send that into orbit. So it had two engines. The engine attached to the scaffolding on the bottom was the descent engine and would lower them down to the planet. It had an engine, nesting doll style, on top of that one that would then take that portion back up into orbit to rendezvous with the command module.
The word ascent, this might be the most that I've ever used that word in my entire life.
Yeah.
Ascent seems like just an odd word to use. Descent's still a little weird, but I think you use it more in normal English.
The lunar module, just that fucking foil covered thing, weighed 33,000 pounds.
So that weighed more than the other one? Or was the other one 60?
No, the other one was 63. Okay. Inside the lunar module, it was almost more spacious and more comfortable than the actual command and service module, because you would have in the command service module, it's this little fucking dome thing. You're all sitting right next to each other in 3 seats with literally the control panel like 2 feet in front of your face. In the lunar module, one of the astronauts, because it's only designed for 2 guys, one of you is actually standing up by the controls, and that's how you're flying it down. That's the piloting the lunar module. And then the other guy is literally just sitting on top of the rocket that's going to get you back up into space. But there was room to move around.
There was room to lay.
Yeah.
The reason this is so wildly interesting, you describing this, is I've gone through this push and pull. When we talk about the actual mission of, like, when you say that the cabin was only 200 square feet or whatever, hearing all the stuff that they brought up with them, I was like, this is bullshit. This is an 8-day mission. There's no way they need all this stuff. They can tough it out without toothbrushes and toothpaste. And then when I really started to think about it, I thought that's 8 days of them being in isolation like that. You're going to want some like normal routine shit that you do to try to keep you from going crazy in a very small thing up in space.
The psychological testing that had to be done with these guys as they're going through their training. We haven't really even touched on their training yet, which is something that we'll try to get into a little bit of detail about. But here's the thing. Like with Apollo 1, 3 weeks before the launch, they're constantly doing this training of getting in the rocket, checking the systems, doing fire, like not firing the rocket, but getting all the systems engaged. They're constantly checking for any problems leading up to it. Everything is done so meticulously. Constantly training in simulators for the actual lunar module. Did you see the simulator? It wasn't a simulator, the vehicle that they built.
Yeah, the LL, we'll get to them.
Okay. So the training is just constant. You're constantly in and out of that capsule. At some point, do you think they put them in that capsule and they're just like, we're going to leave you guys in here for 3 days just as a mock run, just to kind of see what it does psychologically?
Yeah.
You guys can't open this. You guys can talk to us over the radio. We're not going to walk outside. You're not going to see us. We're going to face you toward a dark fucking wall. And it's just going to be dark, and we're going to have you guys live in here like you're going to have to live in here for the 14-day total round trip or whatever it was.
8, but yeah, just that, I mean, you couldn't even, like, send other, like, the backup crew. You couldn't do it with them because those weren't the guys that you were doing it with. You had to test the mental faculties of the 3 guys that were going to be up there.
And could you imagine you're sitting in there and like after the 3rd day you get out and you're talking with the other guys, you're like, yeah, I guess that wasn't so bad. And in your head thinking, you're like, I almost went fucking crazy.
I almost killed Buzz.
Yeah, but I don't want to fucking get put out from this mission. When they finally get back from the moon, one of them is just finally like, I almost literally left you guys.
Yeah.
There was a point when we got there, Collins was like, I was almost just out and back to Earth. I didn't think we could pull this shit off. So kind of getting back to the actual Apollo portion, kind of how that progresses. Oh, last little tidbit about the Saturn V. So the thing was 363 feet tall, 7,500,000 pounds of force for the launch.
That number is incredible. 7 million pounds of launch.
Just a flame shooting out the fucking back of that thing.
The crazy thing, did you see the fails?
Yeah, when they would blow up on the launch pad.
Like when it would fire up, even the test, when it would go like 8 or 10 feet, and then it would just immediately drop back down.
The size of the fucking fireball that engulfed that entire area, just because all of that, it's not fucking gas. It's mixed like liquid nitrogen and mixed with other combustible type stuff that when it hits, it creates a lot more force than just your normal average everyday unleaded.
I want to say, too, I'm not sure if it was minute or second. I think they said that it was like 3,000 gallons a second that the propulsion took to burn.
When they had to put the Saturn V on that big crawler thing, because it had to be built and all assembled inside the vertical assembly building. 130 million cubic feet in that, because it had to fit the rocket standing up. They put it onto. I'm so fascinated by this shit. Modern Marvels had an excellent episode. Old History Channel. They put it onto this crawler. Basically, on top of the crawler sits the actual like launch platform. So it was called the mobile launch platform. The rocket would be set on that, and it would be moved at 1 mile an hour from the vertical assembly area down a slight slope. And because of the slope, the crawler actually had a self-leveling system that it would keep it level the entire time, because the last thing you want is the fucking rocket tipping over. And would bring it out to the launch pad. It would have to be there well in advance of the launch. Because the fueling process out there took place over the course of days to get this fuel in there.
That's the size of this whole thing is just so mind-blowing.
So we end up coming to November 9th. So 67 is, or January 67 is the Apollo 1 incident. We finally get to Apollo 4. They name it Apollo 4, even though it's the next one. I think kind of in homage to the pilots, maybe that died.
I don't know what happened to Apollo 2 and Apollo 3.
I think I don't think they might have been canceled missions because of the hearing and everything. They had
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
They also had a schedule in which every single Apollo mission, they had it earmarked for what, it wasn't just like, we're going to see what we can do on this one and then we'll just do more on the next one. It was, mission is specifically to test this. This mission is specifically to test this, and then all the pieces were going to come together during the final planned mission, or the first mission to actually land on the moon. So you get Apollo 4, it's still under investigation, so this is unmanned, but basically this is the command service module lifting test to make sure that the Saturn rocket can lift it into orbit. That was just the command module. They didn't even put in the lunar module at that point, and again, that was going to add another 33,000 pounds. We get to January 22nd, so we go from a launch in November to a launch in January of 68. We're only at Apollo 5 right now. We got to get to Apollo 11, and it's already 68, and Apollo is in July. Apollo 11's July of 69, right?
Yeah, we're coming up onto the 70s pretty quickly.
So 5 was an uncrewed launch as well, but it launched with the landing module. So now you know that the Saturn V can get all of the necessary equipment up into orbit.
This was still the Saturn IB, I believe. We haven't got to the Saturn V yet.
Gotcha. We have April 4th, so just a couple months later, Apollo 6, again uncrewed. This is with the command service module and the lunar module. It does what's called an orbital translunar injection, and this was the one that the Saturn V, because they had actually tested it for the last couple Apollos, this is the one where because it did all of that reliably, they give it the approval for the crew. So translunar injection was basically a maneuver. Once they got out of Earth orbit, they then have to power themselves and do like a big burn to start heading toward the moon. So part of the 3-stage Saturn rocket would actually launch them on a trajectory toward the moon. And then they would actually do the swap of the lunar module at a later time.
Was this the stage that First stage was to get them up. Second stage was to get them out of Earth's gravitational pull, and then the third stage was to get them into the moon's gravitational orbit, right?
To get them headed toward the moon, to know that the rocket would actually like fire and everything.
Yeah. Well, because you have to have so much force to get you out past that gravitational pull of the world,
Yes.
the Earth, and then you have to have something to get you to the moon's gravitational pull because it's so much tighter.
Well, and what you're doing when you first launch those missions and you're testing this stuff, you're not just getting into orbit and then firing off straight toward the moon. You're getting into orbit and you're sitting there and you're orbiting several times around the Earth, checking all of your systems, making sure everything after the launch, because you can imagine the force of that, rattling everything, all of those electronics that are hand wired and all that shit. You have to make sure everything is working while you're still close enough to Earth to fucking get back onto solid ground.
Just in case anything bad happens.
Exactly. So you're orbiting during that time frame, and then at a certain point, when you start orbiting, you slingshot yourself and do that burn toward the moon. So we come to Apollo 7 in October. Now, this is the first crewed mission, which is why there was a little bit bigger of a gap, April 4th to October 11th. Crewed mission, had the command service module. They did an 11-day orbit around the Earth, testing all of the command service modules stuff. And the reason they did 11 days is, I keep saying 11 or 14, I can't remember what the total time was, but they were trying to get closer to the amount of time, or at the amount of time that would have to be in service in space.
Well, and this was also the first live TV broadcast from a U.S. spacecraft.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah. So all the way back to Apollo 7 was the first time that they had sent video back.
Well, because that was the first manned one. Because
Yeah.
who would want to just
Oh,
see...
yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Who would want to see just the, like, great, it's just the fucking
Nobody-
unmanned rocket just floating around out
Just
there.
a lot of blackout here, I guess.
But to see the proof of having those guys up there and orbiting had to be like a huge, like, we're fucking getting there.
The proof. The proof that everybody starts to wonder about.
So we come to December. They're cruising again, December 21st. Between December 21st and December 27th in 68, Apollo 8 sent up Frank Borman, James Lovell. James Lovell, if that name rings a bell, he's actually one of the astronauts that's on Apollo 13. So James Lovell and William Anders to orbit the moon. Anders.
Got to be Anders Holmvik, right?
There you go. Sorry. So they go from that mission. This is their second fucking crewed mission.
Yeah.
They go from October being like, okay, we're just going to orbit the Earth for 11 days. And then on December for Apollo 8, they're like, well, we've tested it for the amount of time that it would be gone. It's functional. We know from the tests that are going for the translunar ejection or whatever they fucking called it, we know that that works. They were, because of the difference between the Apollo 1 and the Apollo 4 having to cancel those, they were having to kind of push up their timetable to try to make this. So there were missions. Apollo 8 was originally supposed to just do some additional testing and everything. It wasn't supposed to be going for the fucking moon, but one of the guys came up and he's like, everything seems to be working. We can kind of get this thing back on schedule. Why don't we just send them to the moon? Everything's been tested. So they send these 3 guys to the moon to orbit the moon 10 times. This is where we get that fucking badass picture of the Earthrise over the moon. So these guys are just snapping fucking pictures of the moon. They're doing everything they can to try to scout ahead also as part of the mission to find out where they would be able to land if they were able to spot any type of like desirable flat, non-mountainous areas that they would be able to land their actual mission to the moon.
Yeah, there was a little of an uproar about this mission as well. Because during this mission, 21st to the 27th, you're going through Christmas. They actually had a live feed where Durs, Lavelle, and the other guy read passages from the book of Genesis and did some Bible talk while up there to everybody back home. And it plays a little bit of a factor in Apollo 11, but there were some people that were none too happy about Christianity being invoked in this mission, which to me sort of seems funny, because if you were a good God-fearing Christian man and you got sent up into space and you see all of these other things that God that you believe in just
you see how
sort
vast
of
it is.
didn't touch, would that make you question your religion just a little bit?
Me and you had this discussion via text, I believe. These are people of science.
Yeah.
Even the guys come in that are like the naval pilots and everything, which is why the Navy and NASA had such an early integration, because pilots, naturally, you have to have people that can fly.
Mm-hmm.
these are people that I think are very pragmatic. And so I think a lot of people back at Mission Control and back at NASA were just like, you're making it seem like we didn't do anything. Like all of this is because of fucking God's divine intervention of getting you guys to the fucking moon. It's not. It's because of these women in this fucking back room that are running trajectories and fucking launch vectors and all this kind of stuff. And all of us in the fucking engineering group that are building the shit that's keeping you alive.
Team PEMDAS back there is figuring out how to get you launched and get you home. So, I mean, it comes to play a part. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But Apollo 8 was huge. Just the fact that you were able to see the dark side of the moon and kind of be able to start mapping your trajectory for how to hit it.
We got there.
Yeah.
We got to the moon. The easiest part. Now all we got to do is land a guy on the moon. That's going to be so fucking easy. We did the hardest part. Oh.
Yeah.
How fast? Remember when you asked me how fast were they traveling on the way to the moon?
I mean,
25,000 miles per hour. With no resistance, with no wind resistance, no atmospheric resistance or anything like that we're used to on Earth. That's what tears everything and generates heat that will make things fall apart when they're going so too fast. In space, because of the lack of oxygen, there's no atmosphere. Things can travel. There's no resistance. That's why if you send something on a trajectory, it can just keep going and it will not slow down.
He just short-circuited me again. I can't even really put into words how fast that is in my mind.
And because, I mean, you're feeling the G's when the rocket kicks in, but once you get up to speed, because there's no resistance and no gravitational G-forces, what does it even feel like?
It's nothing. That's what I don't understand about it, and that's why I can't get it right in my brain, because if there are no G's because there is no gravity, then you don't feel anything and you're moving that fast. How can you even spot something, like, just to look out? And granted, you're looking at stars that are still hundreds of thousands, if not millions of miles away.
The concept of looking at a close something when you're driving in a car and it passes you much faster than the mountain way off in the distance. You have no frame of reference. You're traveling the fastest that any human has ever traveled in the history of humanity, and you're just sitting there, just no bumps, no nothing. You're just zipping through space at an unimaginable speed.
You're going so fast that if by some stroke of the worst luck possible, that glove that's out there floating in space is somehow in your line, and you hit that glove will explode your spaceship.
Did you see the thing that happened to the block of aluminum when the tiny little piece of aluminum in orbit, how fast it travels, what it did? There's a big block of aluminum. And I don't know if it was part of a satellite or the space, part of shielding for the space station, but a tiny little part of debris. I mean, it was less than an inch. Hit this with such force, it looks like a concave. It looks like someone melted it and then pushed a concave bowl out of it. It's fucking insane. And just like you're saying, you're just hoping that you're not going to hit the smallest little fragment of a meteorite or an asteroid or something like that.
Oh, what was that?
You got to
something hit the windshield.
I think that's got to be something where if you even mention that, they're just like, get the fuck. Nope, not on the mission anymore. We're not going to have that fucking talk.
Maybe God is real, the fact that they didn't hit anything on the way up there. Who knows?
Or maybe there's just enough gravity between Earth and the moon that anything that sits between those two bodies gets pulled into one or the other and it keeps it clear.
It's the scariest thought to have.
Well, we come to Apollo 9 in March, so we've hit 69. We're in March. Apollo 9 works on its rendezvous and docking. So just to kind of explain this, I got my little models here, which you guys can't see. When this thing launches, the Saturn V, the position that everything is in is you have the command service module at the very top of it. Right below it, in kind of a metal housing, encased housing, is you have the lunar module. It's got its legs kind of folded up. Now, if you're thinking about that, that means that the lunar module is basically back where the rocket's going to be for the command service module. So once they get up into space, what happens is the command service module detaches, and the housing around the lunar module has little explosives, and those would hit, and those explosives would explode, sending the casing away. The command service module would have to flip a 180 and go in and dock with it. And then the way that it would fly is the way that looks the most ridiculous, where you have the legs sticking out the front of the craft, and it's just heading toward the moon in that direction. So they practiced that because that was going to be necessary not only to retrieve the lunar module, But once you took it to the moon, detached it, you then had to retrieve it. So that was very important that they did that. They also tested out the EVA suits, which were the suits that you see Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin wearing when they're walking on the moon, to make sure that they were essentially could hold in the atmosphere and that you could move around in them, and they would perform what you needed to.
PLSS backpacks, personal
Life support
system. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. EVA, we keep using that word. It's basically a spacewalk. It's an extravehicular activity. So anything that you're going outside of the vehicle for.
Anything that has to maintain its own atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these little acronyms or whatever that I saw that I would have to go through, like CSM, control.
Command service module.
Or command service module, LM, lunar module. They have to shorthand so much of the stuff because it's just all so big, but you have to be able to talk about it a lot. So instead of saying command service module, CSM, you're on to the next thing.
If you're saying that and you're using that term so many times, yeah, you got to shorten it. Well, we come 2 months later to May and Apollo 10. The guys that are crewing this, Stafford, Young, and Cernan.
I'd have fucking lost my mind if I was these guys.
Okay, these guys know what the mission is.
Oh.
Okay, it's not like a surprise. So you want to tell them what the mission is?
Well, before you start, John Young was the guy that was on Gemini 3 with the guy that died, Gus Grisham.
Okay.
In Apollo 1. So he's been hanging out around for long enough. When I say long enough, it's a matter of a few years. But he's been hanging around for long enough that he saw the initial guy that he went up with in Gemini 3 die in Apollo 1.
I told you, built different.
Yeah.
These guys got... Here's the thing, too, is the pool of astronauts isn't enormous.
No.
Because once they have these guys trained, they're like, we'll just use these guys. And yeah, we'll bring in people every so often. But I mean, these are going to be the guys. Plus, these guys have been testing all this shit. And you could have died, so we probably should reward them by letting them do these missions. So Stafford, Young, and Cernan, they their mission is basically the test run of the Apollo 11 mission, where they are sent with everything that's going to be taken on the Apollo mission, the command service module, the lunar module. They take it all the way to the moon. They get into an orbit. Stafford and Cernan then get into the lunar module and detach. Start taking the lunar module down, down, down. They get to within 50,000 feet, which I know sounds like a lot, but when you're talking about an actual planet and everything, it's not too fucking far at all.
What's cruising altitude? Like 30,000 feet?
Yeah.
So not much more than in an airplane. You're that close.
They're going down.
This is the literal definition. If any man was ever honest about the phrase just the tip, this was just the tip.
So the temptation to keep going down and down all the way to the surface, would that be too much for any man to bear, to be able to do that? I mean, because they were equipped, man. They had the suits.
Yep.
They had the stuff. What is the
we
one
don't
thing?
got to get out. We just got to touch it.
Well, they got to get out and touch one foot, one toe. We're just
Somebody
gonna
would
touch
have
a toe.
to.
Exactly. At the same time. Boop. What's the one thing that they didn't have that would probably be necessary for this?
It had to have been landing.
They shorted them fuel.
Oh, that's what it was. Yeah, that's right.
They only provided them enough fuel to get within 50,000 feet. And had they not then gone back up, or they didn't abort, they just fulfilled what they were doing. The mission was to then launch off of the scaffolding or off of the lunar module bottom portion and then rendezvous back with the command service module in orbit and then head back. Because guess what? If you got down to 50,000 feet, you're fucking 98, 99% there, baby. But for those guys to be looking out the window and being like, it's right fucking there. It's right there. And to be looking at that gas gauge and being like, those motherfuckers.
Yeah, I'd fight somebody when
they
I got back.
They knew that they didn't have the fuel to do it. But just imagine the temptation of looking at the guy and being like, we'd be in the history books. Yeah, we'd be dead. History books, man. We'd be those guys.
It would be the quietest ride home that's ever been
had. Oh my God.
You don't want to talk to it.
An hour after they got down there and they walked around a little bit, and he was like, okay, this is actually boring. This isn't as exciting as I thought it was going to be. And then just fucking kills the other guy that convinced him to do it. So Apollo 10 just plays just the tip with the moon. We're almost there, baby. And before we get to the pièce de résistance of Apollo 11, let's take a bathroom break. Oh my God, Adam. What is that up in the sky? It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's socials. Oh my God. It's faster than Instagram.
That's historically high pod on Instagram.
More powerful than X?
It's historically high, historically HI on X.
Able to leap tall threads in a single bound.
Back to historically high pod on Threads.
And, I mean, I guess there's still Gmail, right?
We got that too. That is historically high podcast at gmail.com.
All right, guys, back to the show. All right, and we're back.
Apollo 11, the granddaddy of them all, the first one. WrestleMania 1. The crew. We have Neil Armstrong, we have Buzz Aldrin, and we have a guy who just got the shortest end of any historical stick. Michael Collins. Michael Collins, we'll talk about him and just how hosed he's gotten.
I feel so bad I didn't know Michael Collins' name.
Yep. Yeah. Our bad, Mike. And Mike's family, because he's dead. Neil Armstrong was the commander of the mission. He was a naval pilot that had actually flown during the Korean War. He was also a test pilot. After his time, he left the Korean War. He went to school, and then he joined the test pilot program. He had actually had like a pretty bad crash that he had to eject from.
Yeah, so he was flying that thing that you said we were going to talk about. So it was the... what was the thing called?
LLTV or the one before it, the next gen?
No, the LLTV. Okay, so basically what it was the testing rig that they would use for the lunar module piloting. And to simulate the 1/6 gravity on the moon, the 1/6 compared to Earth, basically it had a jet engine pointing straight down on it that would make it feel like you were descending at 1/6 gravity, and that would allow you, and then it had the like thrusters on the little gas thrusters on the side, and that's how you would keep it level. So it would train them on how to pilot the lunar module. It was kind of notorious for like, I mean, you look at the guys flying this, and they would say they're like, being a pilot does not help you fly this. Maybe the guy landing the lunar module needs to be a helicopter pilot, because that's what it was. You're hovering and just controlling your descent and ascent.
What? It seems odd, doesn't it? I never would have thought that a helicopter pilot would make you better in this situation.
You're used to working in the vertical. Yeah. I think a lot more than a actual like traditional plane pilot.
At the same time, though, I guess that's the ascent and descent are probably the most important parts of this mission.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, if you look at it, you could say the most important part was staying on course throughout that entire distance between Earth and the moon. There are so many different parts that you can point to. So yeah, he was in a accident where the thing started to tip over on him, and he immediately fucking ejected out of it. And it was already tipping. Like when you see the footage, did you watch it?
No,
it looks like it launches him sideways, and you're like, oh shit, and then it kind of like adjusts him, and he goes up, and the chutes deploy. But with those ejection seats, did you know the pilots? And this could be completely wrong, so correct me, pilots. But you are only allowed to eject out of a plane a very low number of times, 1 or 2 times, because it goes up with such force, it compresses your spine and your vertebrae. And if you do it any more than 2 times, it's some type of like medical issue where you could have like, you're more akin to spinal damage. But very so yeah, he had that little snafu while he was training. So kind of the way that it was set up, you had Armstrong, who was the commander. The commander is just the one overseeing the mission. He's the one, I believe, that sits in the middle seat. Yeah. In the actual command service module, and then he goes down with the lunar module. He's not piloting it, though. He's not piloting the command service module either. So Buzz Aldrin is actually the one that is going to be landing on the moon and is controlling the lunar module. Michael Collins, Big Dog Mike, is the one that actually controls the command service module all the way from launch, going all the way to the moon. He stays in orbit around the moon. He then rendezvous with them, picks them back up, docks, gets them in there, and then drives them all the way back to Earth.
Isn't Neil the one that handles the descent?
No, Buzz is.
I thought he was because he took control of it, I thought.
He took control of it because the computer itself...
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, so it was Buzz that actually did. That comes into play with the big who should step out first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
he was this test pilot for this thing called the Advanced Research Project Agency, ARPA, in 1958. 1962, he's finally selected into the second group of astronauts for Gemini. He was the backup crew for Gemini 5. He flew on Gemini 8. And then he was the backup crew for another Gemini, Gemini 11.
You wrote it really small.
Something that I had to sneak in there.
Gem 11 is what it looks like.
Okay.
So he was getting back in line to where he was either going to be on Gemini 14, no, 13? Yeah, Gemini 13.
Yeah.
Or whatever subsequent Apollo mission, I guess, was coming up, whatnot.
Fast forward all the way to Apollo 9. He ends up missing it because they had made a switch of the crew. But he was slated for Apollo 11. And like Chris was talking about earlier, and I find this so goddamn interesting, is to go through all these stages and different things of being an astronaut and knowing that you can be put on a mission and pulled off of a mission, but there is kind of rhyme to reason of like every third mission you're going to be rotated in. You have to be back up for these.
The learning process too, because the backup crew has to be as well prepared.
Yep.
In any instance to fill in for any of those people. It would be, and there were instances in which, yeah, like you just said, one guy had like bone spur or like some type of like bone spur in his spine or something like that. Yeah, and had to have it, but then he was put back into the rotation as soon as he was, able to perform. So these guys are constantly training. It's not like, hey, just because we're the backup and now we're going to be the backup for this next mission. As soon as that mission launched, they started training for their mission.
Well, and there was also, just because this was a hard fast rule of or not a hard fast rule of threes, kind of like an agreed upon, that's how the rotation went.
Deke Slayton, I think, is the one that came up with that system.
Yeah. It didn't mean that was concrete. Everything was still pretty fluid. It was just, this is what's supposed to happen. So up until launch day, they can swap out anything that they need to.
And this guy, Deke Slayton, he was kind of in charge of crew selection for these missions. He was a former astronaut, but I think I can't remember if he ever went. He went up once.
He got too fat.
Nope. He started having heart palpitations or something with his heart. Yeah. And so then he became, I want to stay in it. So then he started picking the astronauts that got to go on these missions.
Yeah, the whole thought process of having to ramp yourself up to be a backup and then maybe getting called into the show, like you're the understudy, and then 2 weeks before something happens to your lunar commander and you have to jump in there and take that reins. Like, you have to be so ready to where when you do get the news, you're just ready to go. But at the same time, you also have to make peace with just being the backup.
Well, and one of the missions, and it comes into play with Collins, is I think Lovell actually was the one that had to have the surgery.
Collins was the one that had the surgery, I thought.
Oh, and then that's what put him into... Oh, and they offered... I think Armstrong even offered it to Lovell. He was like, do you want to serve as this? And Lovell's like, actually, I'll wait for mine. But can you imagine being in a position where you're on Apollo 8, you're the backup crew.
Yeah.
And you're just like, holy shit, Apollo 11 is that might be the moon one. And all of a sudden, the guy that you're backing up has to back out and you get put into that seat and you're like, but I don't want to go yet. This mission's not this mission's not landing on the moon. They're like, tough, man. Like, then you'll be rotating. You can be a backup on the next, but I don't want to get him back.
Well,
he seems fine. Shingles, he can hold it together for fucking 11 days.
What's the thought process too? And this is just high banter, but of how hard are you lobbying if you're on Apollo 10, like a couple weeks before the mission, be like, hey, I know that we're just supposed to go down and test it, but let's just do it. Why? Shit or get off the pot, man.
Over there by the fuel guys that are fueling up the lunar module, and you just walk over there and being like, how much is it going to cost for you to fucking top the tank off?
Just fill her up. So there's so much of that game of thinking, and these guys, credit to them altogether, like Lovell and Collins, like there's an amount of respect to be like, this guy was slated to be in there. I really want this. Go ahead.
They said you would have certain crews that were training, because again, you're training together for years.
Yeah.
That really got along with friendships and everything, and that were like cohesive units. You then had ones that, perfect example is going to be Apollo 11, where you basically had people that worked in friendly confines, but weren't hanging out outside of work, respected each other for what their jobs were going to be, but it wasn't a warm relationship.
No.
It was business.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not going to barbecues together.
And the thing too about the Apollo 11 guys, all of them were Gemini vets.
Yeah. They've all had it. And a lot of that working relationship, I think, comes into play because of this next guy, Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin was slated to be the lunar module pilot. He was an Air Force pilot who had served in Korea as well. He was also shot down over there, I believe. Aldrin's first astronaut application...
Can't shoot me down in space.
Aldrin's first astronaut application was denied because he hadn't been a test pilot, and at that time for this second round of hiring, which if he would have been a part of the second round of hiring, him and Armstrong would have come out of the same graduating class. The rule was you had to be a test pilot before you could come into NASA.
Can you imagine that? One of the qualifications is you have to be a psycho.
Yeah.
Like, so what, you were flying planes guys had already tested? Oh, you were flying safe planes? No, you got to fly experimental shit that's more likely to kill you if you want to get your foot in the door. We need some real maniacs here.
Chances are you already signed the paperwork that if you die, you can't hold us liable, so we'll keep you in there. Since he was still just in the Air Force and had never gone the test pilot route, he didn't have the qualifications, so he was declined for the second group. Third group, he does get in. There is a change in rules to where you can either be a test pilot or you have to have, it was like 2,000 hours in a certain jet vehicle or something like that he had. So he was able to go in this third group.
They're starting to branch out.
Yeah.
They're needing more guys.
He was a part of the Gemini 12, the EVA walks, and he was the backup for Apollo 9. So again, had his guy dropped out of Apollo 9 and had he been put in on Apollo 9, he wouldn't have made it on there. He wouldn't have made it on this ship. Michael Collins, the sadly not always mentioned Michael Collins, was the control module pilot. He was the guy that was going to be in orbit, waiting, not getting to go down, as just another sad truth to this.
Having to be by himself.
Yeah.
Not
a long period of time.
Yeah, so not since they sent up just, the first unmanned, or not, the first manned ones. What was the guy's name that did that? Fuck, we just mentioned his name.
Alan Shepard.
You are now, I know you got your guys with you during the trip there, so, at least don't have the isolation. But after they leave, and you're just constantly orbiting the moon, the furthest away from Earth anyone has ever been, you're by yourself. You don't, you're talking to them down there, but something bad could happen down there, and then you're just heading back by yourself. That might get to me a little bit.
I didn't even think of that.
That might get to me a little bit. This guy said after he was going around the moon, he's like, no. He's like, it didn't bother me. He's like, I felt so many emotions while I was up there. He's like, exhilaration and euphoria. And he's like, it was crazy. He's like, I never felt myself get scared.
Holy shit. I thought you were talking about, that never even occurred to me. I thought you were talking about the fact that he would orbit the moon, and I wrote this down here later, so we'll probably cover it again in a little bit more detail, but you orbit around the moon once every 2 hours. You can only be in radio control, or you're outside of radio control, like being able to speak to anybody, for 48 minutes while you're on the other side of the moon. So you're up there for 2 hours. I want to say, and we'll get this exactly, he orbited for 22 hours, something like that? That's what we'll get to.
Yeah. Oh
for
my God.
48 minutes of every one of those 2 hours, he was just alone.
Oh my God. This brought up something I heard. So when he was up there, there was one of the warning codes going off. Like a lot of these, because they are using computers, they're getting codes, and they could be something as simple as like something super minor.
Yeah.
I can't think of an example right now.
There's a toenail clipping blocking this circuit.
Some shit like that, yeah. So he starts getting this code that pops up, and one of the guys back there was like, okay, what you need to do is you need to do this and this and this. You need to turn it off for a while, and then you need to take manual control. He's like, okay. So he's like, all I did, he's like, I literally just turned it off and turned it back on, and it just kept working. He's like, that's what I did during the time. And he's like, and it ended up resolving itself during like the next pass behind the moon. He's like, the problem has fixed itself.
Then when he gets out on the other side, they asked him how he got it fixed. He's like, yeah, I took care of it.
Just so you guys know, for future missions, on off, on off. It's as simple as that.
real
Save your
quick.
guys the time in the manual.
He was an Air Force Reserve pilot. He was also a test pilot. He was a part of the same third group with Aldrin that came in. He was a backup pilot for Gemini 7. He flew on Gemini 10. And he was Capcom, what does it mean? Captain Communication?
It's I can't
Capsule
remember.
Communication?
I think it is capsule,
Okay.
something like that. So Capcom, we were talking about this during the break, right?
Yeah, it's not just a video game company.
Yeah. So the Capcom was the one person in mission control at Houston that was communicating with the astronauts. It wasn't like all those guys in headsets when you see mission control all had a line to the astronauts. That was for communication to their different departments and things like that they could, during these missions, each of those guys is a representative of a certain larger group of people that are working on a certain aspect of this.
It's like a draft room.
So if something starts happening in this thing, like guidance, that guy is looking at everything and he's talking back to the entire guidance team who's waiting back there as well to solve any of those issues and pass him the information. So it's not just the guys in mission control. Everyone has a fucking team behind them. Those are just like the main guys watching all like the readouts. So I completely forgot where I was going with this. Wow.
Capcom.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So being the only people that could communicate, the only people that were selected for Capcom were other astronauts because they knew the nomenclature, they knew how to talk, the stressful situations, all that kind of stuff. So all the information would be fed to them. They would then communicate that to the astronauts that were in space. They would then send information back. He would then let them know what was going on, or they would be heard over the radios. But that's pretty nuts, man, that only one person was in communication with them. It could have been one of your boys that knew what you were going through.
That to me is one thing that stands out among everything else is when you listen to the communications back and forth, the zero excitement and just sanitary clean. Like if I was up there, I would be screaming at the top of my lungs.
The stoicism.
Yeah.
Just to be like, okay, we got an alarm going off.
Got a 1201. What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. And you can hear in the background it's going and it's probably fucking flashing red.
Yeah.
And he's just like, can you just let us know what it means? They're like, hold please.
Anything?
Yeah.
Anything?
Yeah, we'll get right back to you. And communication also, what was the gap? 3 minutes? Or was it 30 seconds?
I think it was only 30 seconds.
Okay, so 30 seconds for a message, which that's even insane to think about that we had 30-second communication all the way that distance, that we had that technology.
I mean, we're going to the moon. You got to have
It
that
is,
technology.
but I tried to make the comparison in my head. Dude, this is like 25 years removed from fucking World War II. And we're heading for the fucking moon.
Yeah, just to put this into perspective, the Capcom wasn't real clear, and we'll talk about when things don't get super clear a little bit later on. But he was Capcom for Apollo 8 after the back surgery, so he was sidelined off of Apollo 8.
Which is why he then becomes on Apollo 11 because of the 3. Yep.
Because of that back surgery.
Okay.
The training missions that they went on, or I guess the training modules that they went on, what we were talking about and couldn't remember earlier that blew up on Armstrong, the Lunar Excursion Module, the LEM, was the first training module that they had for the lander. They practiced all their landing techniques on it. It was a shaky one that wasn't great.
They
Then-
actually do that in For All Mankind. They have that someone ends up getting killed on it.
Really?
But it shows you how they were training on it, and it looks exactly my mind. I just made that connection.
Its follow-up was the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle. This one was actually pretty great. It helped you practice takeoffs and your landings again. They had the EMU, so if you were going to go on an EVA, an extravehicular mobility unit, they would be training out the suits. They would simulate using these lunar tools, the electric ones that Chris was talking about, on the moon's surface. So you would have, something that was a different size, weight, anything like that. And you're wearing a giant suit that looks like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and you have to have enough finger dexterity to run tools.
That's what I'm saying, is they're literally sitting there being like, so what are we doing today? They're like, so we're going to bring you into this room and put you in your suit, and we just want you to hold this pick and hit rocks. And then tell us, is it hard to hit the rocks? What can we do better to help you hit the rocks in this suit? Can it be sharper? Does it need to be shorter? It was so just, the details were so minute that they had all of these different training for any different scenario that they could be thinking of. What you're talking about the mobility one, where they would put them in like the harnesses to where it would take off and only provide 1/6 gravity. So they would be trying to move. And the way that they found to do it on the training, they're like, okay, we're kind of getting the hang of this. And then they get to the moon, they're like, yeah, that shit doesn't work.
Not bad training. Bad
Like,
training.
it does not feel like this at all. And so they had to develop new movement techniques, like, because no one had felt this lack of gravity before.
Yeah, that's so amazing to me. G-force training had to be huge. Well, you're not getting any G's when you're in space. You still have to worry about takeoff and landing.
Is that the spinning thing, you think?
Yeah, it had from the Bond movie, from Moonraker.
Yeah.
It has to be that one.
Yeah.
So very, very important. Probably the most important is zero gravity training. Actually second most important for the one after it, but zero gravity training. Yeah. You have to understand how to move inside this spaceship so you don't just go careening into a wall of circuits that if you break, you're fucking dead.
Vomit Comet, baby. That's the plane that takes them up and then goes into the parabolic dives.
It looks like so much fun.
I know.
I would love to feel that, but at the same time, I just don't know if I can trust that.
So at the same time as these guys being slated to basically land on the moon, not being, crazy enough, they had to do everything they could while they were there. Like, I don't know if they figured they'd never be back, but this was the first opportunity that they ever had to get back samples. They also brought in like geologists to train these guys to identify different rock formations, what this could be, how to identify sediment and what certain things meant. So they were actually scientists on the moons, on the moon itself. They also did some training in the planting of the flag, which comes back into play that apparently this training was not very good.
Dog shit.
And then what happened when they were going to get home, where the capsule would come and land back in the ocean. And how did you, if something happened, because didn't one of the capsules at one point, it kind of took on water and started to sink?
I want to say that was the Grissom. I think the one that he didn't die on.
Okay, yeah, I was looking at you for a second. But, so yeah, like water escape and how to get to like the life rafts that would be, there was like compartments for life rafts or something like that in the lander. But pretty much preparing for anything and everything.
If the first 99% of this training didn't send you over the edge, I feel like the last thing that you're training is water escapes. Like, we just did all this to worry about going up into space and to being alive. Now you're going to send us back to something that we know is pretty dangerous, just setting us down in the middle of the ocean and hoping that we hit the right spot.
They didn't have a way to land them anywhere else.
Yeah.
Like, you look at how they had to have such a wide area that they could land in that there was no other option of being like, well, I guess you could just land. We'll make you a big fucking cushion.
Or it's the softest landing that you could get.
Exactly.
But at the same time, if you just veer off course somehow and the boats aren't in that area and then you have to hit the water and figure out how to survive, they said, I think it goes along with
the floaties, man.
Yeah, well, then they had floaties. Yeah. But every time up until they created the floaties, I believe it was the packers of the parachutes for the lander. Mm-hmm. There were 3 people that were trained, and it was like the presidential rule where none of those 3 could ever travel in the same car at the same time. Like, they were that important to the mission that they couldn't ever be in the same place at the same time.
Some guy just sitting at the bar. What do? Pack parachutes. Oh, that's all I do. Every time an astronaut lands back safely on Earth, that's me.
These hands.
Each of them packs one of them. So if one person's having an off day, the other 2, yeah.
Yeah. Just that much safety went into this whole thing. Getting to the whole thing. 1 million spectators watched the launch of Apollo 11 from Kennedy Space Center on July 16th, 1969. Spectators, not watching it on TV. 1 million people showed up to watch this launch.
Anybody that you could get a sightline on this, and because it's a big fucking rocket, you could be watching this from miles away. As long as you had a sightline, there would be people out in boats that would be able to go ahead and watch the rocket take off.
didn't even think about being out on the water.
Yeah.
But you have to think, if you're even anywhere close, this is so gigantic that you could be 50 miles away and probably still see takeoff just fine.
As soon as it was up high enough
Yeah.
and that plume of smoke that's coming out at the bottom, yeah, I'm sure you'd see it.
Along with that, the Saturn V that we talked about was propelled. The command module and the lunar module that were both out of the Earth's atmosphere as the Stage 3 rocket pieces started to fall away. So this is what gets us out of the atmosphere. We have the gravitational pull to pull up. They make it through that. The trip took 3 days. And I think this was one of the first things that I texted you about this. I had no idea. If you had asked me how long that it took to get to the moon, I would have told you 2 weeks. And then I would have said that they were probably on the moon for a couple days and that they took another 2 weeks to come home. I understand because of how fast you said they went that I still don't really comprehend that it would be that far to get there. But do you remember how far it was to the moon?
I don't. I was hoping you had that information. So while you're looking that up, just to kind of think about it from this perspective, it's so far away that traveling at that speed, it still takes you 3 days. Well, does that also include the orbiting time around the Earth, the switching, getting the landing module, and then heading to the moon?
Yeah, I would assume so.
Even so, it's still close enough, and the Earth's gravity still keeps it in orbit around us.
238,900 miles away was how far they traveled in 3 days.
Just hauling fucking ass.
Yeah. And the whole time, this was covered everywhere, all over the world. This is a pretty big deal. Russia, of course, watching in wonderment when the newspapers came out. It wasn't something that they wanted to celebrate. They had made mention in an article that they had called Armstrong, since he was the commander, Tsar. So he was Tsar Armstrong. And one of the times when Mission Control called up to talk to Armstrong, they asked for him, and Collins jumped on, and he goes, Tsar Armstrong is actually busy brushing his teeth, so I'm stepping in for him right now. We're all good. Like, just little shit like that. And
keeping it light. Keeping it light.
When we were talking about the amount of room that you had in this just very tiny space, I would think that 8 days, maybe we don't worry about brushing our teeth. Just maybe we don't pack in a weight-based mission. Maybe we don't worry about throwing the toothbrushes and toothpaste onto the ship. But at the same time, like we were talking about before, the isolation and the scariness of this situation, you have to have mundane tasks to take your mind off of things.
You get back and it's just the bristles are like whittled halfway down. Like, how long were you brushing your teeth? It was like, it was fucking stressful up there.
Eight times a day.
Yeah, this is one of the only normal things I could fucking do.
Just the whole experience to be floating around and seeing. There's a NASA channel on the cable package that we have, and every once in a while I just flip to it when I'm high to kind of see what's going on in the world of space. And there's always a video of them in zero gravity, and it never ceases to amaze me to see like a liquid up in
when it globs
zero
together.
gravity. Yeah. And just to see how they do things on a normal basis. And I asked you this today, how do you think they slept? Do you know how they slept? Because would you have to be strapped down like you?
You mean on the space shuttle?
Yeah.
So I think on the space shuttle, it's like maybe a bunk system, or maybe I think you actually zip yourself into like a tighter sleeping bag that holds you, and then I think you're suspended kind of tightly between.
Okay.
And it's removable. So when you're going to go to sleep to save space, I think you can roll up the sleeping bags or like put them away.
So it's not like a conehead situation where they sit into the wall.
Or it's carved out. Like
Yeah,
around them. No, I don't
held
believe it's a
in there.
conehead situation.
There's just so many different things.
It's conehead-esque.
A little bit, yeah. Conehead-esque. But they had enough room to carry enough supplies. And I'm bummed that we didn't add this, but we're going to have to talk about other fun things that happened, and maybe we can do that during the Cold War. But they had test flights for Gemini where they were actually taking up astronaut food and testing it in space to see like what they could do and what they could get away with. And I don't remember. I should have looked this up more.
Johnson, why is there Cheeto dust in the fucking console?
So I forgot what it was. It must have been one of Gemini, but they sent them up and they were testing all these astronaut foods. And this dude, one of the astronauts, pulls out a sandwich from his pocket. It was like a pastrami sandwich or something like that. That somebody had slipped him on the ground and told him to try it out in space.
When they were getting them situated in the capsule, one of the guys up there was like, take this fucking Sammy.
He pulls it out and he starts eating it. He's like, this pastrami sandwich doesn't really work well in space. And one of the guys down at Mission Control goes, did you say pastrami sandwich? And they go, yeah, was that not on the approved thing? And they looked through all the approved list of foods and it wasn't on there. Like, how did you get a pastrami sandwich up there?
We get freeze-dried pastrami sandwiches on the menu.
They
you
were
stop in the cafeteria on your way to the launch pad?
They were so concerned that the crumbs of the sandwich in zero gravity were going to clog one of the systems up there.
They didn't know, like, how they could fucking do anything.
They said that once he got down, he got like a massive punishment, and they called the sandwich something like the $50,000 pastrami sandwich because that's what it cost, like, to fix the systems that it could have ruined.
They didn't have tiny vacuums.
Yeah, they had all of this fun tech that they created these meals that you start to see just like watching that channel, and to see that there's a tube of goo that's just an entire baked apple pie that they have to figure out how to break it down enough to where you're just getting the actual nutrients that you need, but still need to make sure that it doesn't taste like such shit that it can be eaten.
That was like a constant complaint. They're like, the food fucking sucks, like all the freeze-dried shit.
Yeah, I remember as a kid in like second grade, somebody went to Disney World and they got astronaut ice cream. And they were cool enough that their parents bought a bunch of it and brought it back, and we all got to... It might have been the teacher that did it.
That's a thing now. You can just buy freeze-dried ice cream now.
Yeah. But second-year-old Adam, as soon as I tasted that freeze-dried ice cream, I was like, this is what the astronauts eat?
So the first time I ever tried that was probably like a year ago.
Yeah.
And the kid loved it because it's something about it's crunchy and hard.
It's fun.
It's fun, but at the same time, it's just like, yeah, I wouldn't pick this over a regular ice cream sandwich.
But you need that mental okayness.
Yeah, that's true. Like I'm giving myself a little treat in space.
Yeah, it's just so fucking interesting.
So Collins pilots them for 3 days to get to the moon. On July 20th, once they're able to kind of establish and get into, basically they're heading there, with the legs pointing out from the lander. And as they get there, they have to, rotate the spaceship and burn the thrusters to slow themselves down enough to get into a lunar orbit.
That completely missed me too. That's how they had to slow down, was to just rotate and then start firing.
Just turn around and fire the other direction.
I had no idea how they would have slowed themselves beyond that, but as soon as I heard it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So after they get situated and everything like that, they crawl through the tunnel to get into the lunar module, and Neil and Buzz, they're already in their suits. So it took them a while within that small, capsule and everything to get their suits on and make sure they're all tested. They end up landing on July 20th in the Sea of Tranquility. So they detach from the command service module. Aldrin is heading down. Armstrong sitting on literally the top of the rocket that's going to launch them back, like the cap of it inside. And they're moving down with this descent engine, and the lander itself also has off the footings where it's going to land are these like 5-foot probes that are
they're like tentacles that feel for the ground.
Yeah, so they would give you like, if you're coming too fast, or they would give you a sense that you're that close. They would just collapse and crush as the thing landed. Also, the legs on this thing were called crush legs because they were a honeycomb system inside, that because they didn't have actual shock absorbers because of the weight, they had to make these legs to where if it got too much pressure, it wouldn't compromise the integrity of like the actual structure to launch it again. So it would crush a little bit and it would absorb some of the shock.
Well, and it was actually built to do this. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves because there's a lot of fun shit that happens. But these legs were built to do this because they needed to do it, because they believed that the surface that they were hitting was going to be tougher, to where when they crushed, the ladder would actually be closer to the ground than it ended up being. So they detach away. First transmission down. The Eagle has wings.
Oh, yeah. So let's get to the naming. This is a fun little...
we forgot about that, huh?
So all of the astronauts in these crews, they all named their, lunar modules, they named their CSMs, all that kind of stuff. Well, because this was such a prolific mission, a lot of their names were kind of funny and goofy and poking fun at the spacecraft. So the original names for the Apollo 11 was the snow cone for the command service
Makes
module,
sense.
and then haystack for the lunar module. I don't really, because of the color, I'm not really sure.
Oh yeah, I can see that.
So NASA PR was like, yeah, you can't fucking use snow cone and haystack. That doesn't, the haystack is like, come on, man. So they ended up coming up with the names for the lunar module, Eagle. And then for the CSM was Columbia, because Columbia was the name of the first ship that someone had, oh no, it was from a Jules Verne book, like a Space Odyssey or something like that. It was named after like the cannon from Jules
Really?
Verne book. Yeah.
Oh, I just thought it was Columbus first time discovery.
I don't think so. I think it was something out of like a. So, the mission patch too is fuck. Did you see the mission
Yeah.
patch? It's the most just blatant. It all it is it's literally the moon kind of down near the bottom, like the concave of the moon, Earth in the background, like half of Earth being shaded, and then just a fucking bald eagle right in the middle of it, just landing on the moon. And originally they were like, let's have it have an olive branch in its fucking mouth. And then they came back and they're like, the talons are too long and too warlike. Have him gripping the olive branch, but you can still have your eagle. So yeah, so they named the lunar module Eagle. So the eagle has wings.
As they started the descent down, probably the scariest thing that could have possibly happened. They had actually etched landing marks on the windows, so as they were going down, they could kind of gauge where they were.
By like the horizon or something.
They started passing landing marks 2 to 3 seconds before they were supposed to, and that meant that they were on a trajectory to do something that was called landing long. There were a couple theories behind what had happened, and something that doesn't make any sense but makes the most sense to me was, I forgot the guy's name that was in charge of the whole entire thing. I don't think he was a Nazi. But he had surmised that there was still a little bit of oxygen left in the passageway of the undocking, that as the Eagle separated from the Columbia, there was the combustion of that oxygen.
It pushed it down
and
a
it
little
pushed
bit.
it just enough off course from just a little bit of oxygen.
Before they could rotate and then start their descent.
Yeah, that sent them into this long pattern. Now, if you're landing on a completely smooth surface, not the biggest deal ever. They have to land in something called the Sea of Tranquility, which is also still pockmarked with a bunch of
Craters and boulders that are
Yeah.
caused by the impacts and stuff that it caused the craters and
Exactly.
everything.
So landing long in this situation could be extremely dangerous.
We may not have
because-
scouted that side. It may
Yeah.
be completely different. We might have tried to stay away from that fucking area.
Yep. So after that happened, they realized that they were going to be landing long. Armstrong eventually ends up overriding the computer to take control of it, and he uses that LLVT training that he had to take the manual control.
Are you sure? Because
I thought it was him because I think Buzz was the one that was calling out the fuel to him.
I know that Aldrin he was the lunar module pilot. It was
Okay.
so the descent. They had computers enough at this point that the computer was actually controlling the descent. And it got to a point because they saw they started to go long and everything, that in order to, and this is what he had trained for, in order to correct the course and just be able to make alterations, that's when they were going to override the computer to let him take manual control. During also this process of landing, what was the error code that the computer kept throwing off?
It threw a 1202, and during this 1202 was the first error code that went up. And once this error code sounds, he immediately radios back down to mission control, and he says, hey, 1202 error coming up. What is that? They have to scramble to figure this out, because if it throws an alarm, it could be literally anything. It could be something massive. It could be something minor. So when they're researching what this 1202 alarm is, they're going through, and one of the members of Mission Control that was running through some of the simulations before had seen this 1202 number pop up, and he had actually created a key that gave all of the error codes that were thrown during the trainings, which is brilliant because
Oh, yeah.
to find anything that wasn't being thrown during a training would be kind of weird because this is a training, but you're also actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you know the common things that happen during training, this is what training is for. He flips to 1202, finds out that what 1202 means is it's a computer system that's still running old software that should have been closed out.
It's overloaded. It's like when your phone is running too many programs,
Yeah,
you have too many
exactly.
windows open, and it's running slow. It was saying basically I'm running too many tasks at this point.
And I need to restart. So they go ahead and they throw this back up. He says, "You're good to go. Keep going on." A little bit later, 1201 alarm starts popping up on the screen. Again, 1201, what does this mean? He goes through, he sees it's the exact same as 1202, basically. It's very similar. It's just a different system that's throwing that same code. Not necessary for landing. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be extremely scary. But under the circumstance that the way COM was set up was it was a antenna that was on top of the lander, and they had set it up on a program that had the trajectory to where nothing could really be in the way of it.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't figure out that if it was at a tilt on the lander, it would have to travel through the lander to get there.
Oh, okay.
So it was breaking up bad enough to where they could still send comms up to Collins,
Mm-hmm.
and then Collins would have to relay the message down there
Okay.
and do it in a telephone system.
Oh, that's why when they eventually did land, they're like, there's a lot of guys that are blue in the face here at Mission Control because they weren't getting up to date. Like their information was
Exactly.
farther behind. So they could have had crashed for a minute before they even found out anything. Okay, yeah, that's
And
right.
Collins would have had to have given the news that they had crashed
Yeah.
if that had happened. Luckily, Armstrong, with this piloting prowess that he had, he gets a scatter transmission that he needs to tilt the lander so they can get better control back of the comm system. He ends up tilting it. As they're going down on this descent, all these comms are causing issues, but the biggest issue is that 6,000 feet or 1,800 meters above the surface, the guidance computer started sounding these alarms. That was taken care of. Still okay. We get to the fuel. The fuel, they were 100 feet away from the surface, and they had 90 seconds of propellant left. Now, this is what was confusing to me about this whole entire thing, was because I was wondering why you would need propellant for descent. But just like you explained, and that I finally understood, they needed propellant for the descent because they had to choke that gravity off, that 1/6 gravity off enough to where they could slow themselves down enough to where they just wouldn't go careening into the moon.
So they needed it, I think, for kind of a dual purpose. So they needed it because after they undocked from the command module,
Yeah.
they had to then rotate themselves in a manner. So the thrusters that they have, the directional thrusters that they put on these, they basically look like whenever you see a movie where they're doing like a air raid alarm and you have like the 3 or 4 like bullhorn things all connected
yeah.
and they're all pointing in in a square and whatnot, or like a cross.
Yeah.
That's basically what they had at certain segments or certain sections on the lunar module and on the command service module, because what that allowed you to do is by having those on like 4 sides, it gave you the option of doing any type of corrections because you could fire this one up, this one to the left. And so that's how they would fire their thrusters. So as they're coming down and Eagle's coming down, they're lowering, but then they have to start, when they start finding out they're going long,
Course correction.
they have to do the course corrections to tilt themselves and almost start to move sideways instead of down as they're looking at the ground, because that's what Aldrin's doing. He's like, I'm trying to look for a smooth spot. Depth perception had to have been crazy because you're looking at something that you've never seen before, and the shadowing and shading might be crazy, and so your depth of field might get thrown off.
So is this something that ships might have taken from space instead of the other way around? Because now ships have side thrusters.
You're talking about like cruise ships to park and do
Yeah.
that. Yeah, 100%.
Interesting. Yeah. You still need fuel for all that.
And because they're going long and they're having to stay at a certain, they're not coming down as quickly.
Yeah.
And because of this, yeah, they got within, I think you said 90 seconds and 100 feet. They got all the way down. It took them a minute to get down to that 100 feet, and they ended up touching down where they were 30 seconds away from having to abort the mission or not have enough fuel to get back up and rendezvous. It was that close. Mission control, because they were 30 seconds behind, they didn't know they had landed, and they're sitting there looking at the clock and they're not getting a transmission. And then finally, with it could have been no time left for them, they're like, the Eagle has landed, and like, oh fuck, it's 30 seconds behind. We did it.
Well, the funny thing about it was them landing with this 30 seconds of propellant left. It was actually more like 45, which still doesn't seem like enough, but it's pretty close. They said that there was extra propellant that they hadn't accounted for, and I think it took them a couple more missions after this to figure out what it was, but they couldn't get an accurate reading as to how many seconds were left because of the sloshing around of the propellant in the tank. Which makes total sense because even though there's zero weight, you're still jockeying back and forth.
It's like one of those basic fuel gauges that uses the float. So if it's going back and forth, it's going all over the place.
It's like if you're driving an old car and you go over a bump and you watch the gas gauge go up and down.
My truck did that. It was parked on a slant. I had way more gas.
You always wanted to park on a slant so you felt better getting in. We get touchdown. Touchdown light happens. Everybody's fine. There's this little bit of silence. Everybody is on the edge of their seat at this point, just fucking freaking out. Did they make it? Did they not? All of a sudden, Buzz Aldrin's voice comes on. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. And the Capcom guy was befuddled. In his response, he actually stumbled over his words because it was Armstrong's idea to say Tranquility Base here instead of Eagle Base here because they landed in the Sea of Tranquility. Yeah. So as soon as the dude heard it, he's like, oh, they made it. Okay, well, I need to respond. And when he responds back, he goes, Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. When I first heard that, it finally hit me, and I was like, those guys at Mission Control were probably nobody took a breath in there for the last minute and a half of that.
The quietest fucking room, aside from the guys just browning their pants.
And then they said after they heard it, there were cheers and everybody went nuts, and all of the management that was there watching, everybody's like, hey, everybody shut up. We still got a mission to do. All they did was land.
Mission controllers were like, you realize this isn't we're still in the most dangerous portion of this mission.
This isn't even halftime, fellas. This is midway through the second quarter.
Yeah, you still got a lot of game ahead of you.
Well, once this happened...
Collins is just up there by himself. One is the loneliest number.
He had to have heard that column too.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he was on it the entire time, and he was also running his own experiments, and he was watching out and trying to It took him a while also to locate them because part of his job when he was coming over their area was to try to spot them. But I don't know what kind of telescope you're using from lens you have to try to spot them from that high up.
That's true. I didn't even think about that.
But it took him a few, he's coming around, you said 2 hours?
Every 2 hours,
So it took him a while, but he did end up finding after talking with NASA and kind of putting the information together about how far they went and how much fuel that they used. I think he ended up being able to locate them.
And to say that NASA put a man on a moon and they're incredibly smart, pretty accurate. Say they were pretty dumb, also pretty accurate. They had slated in the schedule that upon landing on the moon, they were to take a 5-hour rest period to sleep.
In their defense, when they first got into orbit, they were supposed to take their rest then, before they got into the lunar module and went down. I think the deal they made was we're fine, let us at least get down there, and then we'll sleep once we're down there.
How did you sleep the night before you were going to Disney World?
I didn't. And not only that, but I was in a very comfortable bed.
Yeah. So to think that these dudes were just going to sleep after landing on the moon was silly.
No.
3 hours after they had already landed, the preparations to walk on the moon began. The 3 hours encompassed them figuring out if landing didn't just absolutely fuck them getting out of there.
Oh, yeah. They had to check everything. The ascent rocket was super simple because they were afraid of that very thing happening.
Yeah.
And so it was the type of propellant that it was a reaction when the two propellants mixed. There was nothing necessary to create a catalyst for the explosion or the combustion. So it was as simple as they could make it, but that was one of the things they were concerned about. Okay, did anything get damaged to where it's not going to allow us to take off?
Yeah, just the things that they had to go through, everything had to be checked. And funny enough, we'll get to something that happened that was a pretty scary but brilliant moment. 6 hours after they had landed, Armstrong begins climbing down the ladder to the moon.
Yeah, so they're also getting their spacesuits on at this point.
Which, in that tiny area, giant spacesuits, not going to be easy.
Yeah. Or they might have worn their suits down.
You think so?
Yeah, maybe they were just checking other shit out. And you did say they had to sleep, right? So how did they sleep?
They didn't. They disregarded the first 5 hour sleep period because, like, we got to get out there and do it. We'll take the rest period after we get done with what we're doing because they weren't out there for that long.
Yeah, that's true.
So, Armstrong begins climbing down the ladder to the moon. The reason why I said that twice is because Neil Armstrong was the first guy that walked onto the moon. How would they have gone about choosing Neil Armstrong? There had to have been rhyme to some sort of reason, right?
So there's some debate. Most of it coming from one source.
Not a great debate if it's just from one source. But.
So earlier on, it wasn't just rock, paper, scissors, flip a coin type shit in the lunar module to figure this out. That's going to lead to a fucking fight. Can you imagine that? Trying to pull someone back in and dive out yourself?
Yeah.
It was determined. It was kind of undecided. They really didn't know. That's one of the first things when they started making this, like the astronauts and the controllers and available to the press, where they would do press conferences to update them on the status. The question they would always get is like, who's going to be first? Who's going to be first? He's like, we haven't made that decision. That decision will be made at a later date. Being the mission commander and the senior officer in that scenario, it was chosen as Neil Armstrong. Buzz wasn't happy about that.
No.
So Buzz had the opinion that because his position in the lunar module was closer to the door, it would be easier for him to get out of it, which I don't understand because they were in there for what was going to be a required 3 hours that turned into, 6?
Yep.
So he was going around to all the other lunar module, navigator, pilot, whatever, and trying to, lobby them to being like, it should always be us out the front. Oh, we should always be the first ones to touch the lunar surface first. And they're like, Buzz, listen, after you guys, it's just who's third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth. You're only saying this shit because you want to be the first one out there. And it was decided because of the fact that he was the senior officer and mission commander that it would be Neil Armstrong. But there's been I think Buzz has been salty about that for pretty much his entire life.
Blamed his alcoholism on it.
Mm-hmm.
As he was going down the 9 steps, he pulled on a lanyard that activated a TV camera. And 600 million people were on the other end of that TV camera. I don't know what the U.S. population was at that time, but that's like 2 U.S. populations all around the world. As Armstrong lands down on the moon.
He has to jump off the bottom rung, like you were saying, because they thought it was going to compress more.
Yep.
So he was looking down when he got to that last step and was like, I don't know how I can jump or shift around in this.
Never done this before.
Yeah. So he's looking at that and he's like, fuck, I wonder if that's too low. So finally you see him take a jump and it's up to above his knees.
Yeah.
Or it comes in, he just lands. Can you think of what's going on in his head? He's like, okay, I would just do a test jump. That would be my first action after I step down on it, would to be like, okay, let me see if I can just pull myself back up onto this real quick. That'd be hilarious to see on that footage as you see him land and then turn and look up at the ladder and then face it and try to do a couple jumps, get up on it and then give a thumbs up to the camera, and then hop back down.
It would be even better if we got the visual of him doing that very uneasy step that you do when you're coming down off of a ladder where your toes pointed all the way to the ground, where you're trying to probe and feel if it's close enough.
In the pool, reaching for that one step
Yep.
that's actually not there. You're reaching deep to see if it's down there.
But he lands, and then we get the most annoying part of this entire episode to me. As he lands, and he says, maybe, maybe not. This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The reason why this pisses me off is because there is debate about him saying one small step for a man, which he says that he said that wasn't picked up on the transcription, instead of one small step for man. It's the most insignificant bullshit detail that we should never ever worry about talking about.
No, it's been argued. He
Yeah.
says that and they're like, well, he did have a Minnesota or Wisconsin or something accent, and they say, fora, or one small step fora. And they're like, we've gone through the audio, we've analyzed and we've singled out certain aspects, and you can hear that there's an A in there. Who fucking cares? Either way, to me, it sounds good. It doesn't sound stupid when he says one small step for man, because he's just saying, to me, that says a man.
Yeah.
He's like, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It makes perfect sense to me, even without the A. If the fact that people even debate that with all this other shit around it is pretty ridiculous.
And not to mention, this is a guy that has to remember a line that he had pre-thought of, basically.
Can you imagine, though? He's gone another. He's like, one small step for a man, one small step for a man. And he gets in, he looks down, and he has to do that jump. And then after he lands, he gets rattled a bit. And he's like, one small step for man, God, one giant leap for mankind.
Yeah.
Turns off his microphone. He's like, fuck.
He's got a lot of other stuff on his mind. 7 minutes into him landing, he collects what's called a contingency sample. Pretty funny why they have to do this. He jumped out and had like a little pooper scooper and scooped up some dirt, throw it in one of his pockets. The reason he had it was because the contingency plan was if they landed on the moon and they got out and something went wrong and they had to go ahead and leave again, they at least got something.
So proof that we landed.
Yeah.
When they landed, they were expecting it more to be kind of like sandy, more kind of, I guess, like a deeper sand, like a beach.
Yeah.
They said that it was such a fine powder on the surface, and it was only about did they say about 2 inches? Like you could scoop your foot under a little bit, but it was so fine. Come to find out, this is cool as shit to me. 30 to 60% of the moon's surface is glass. It's just ground up fine glass, and it's reflective, and that's why the moon is so bright.
What, it glows?
It's like a reflector dish.
No way.
That's why it glows so bright, is because the surface of the moon is made up of reflective particulate.
The other extremely cool thing that I learned about the Earth or the moon's surface was the reason why the dust doesn't get kicked up is because if you're on the ground and you step in dirt here, you're either pushing oxygen down into the dirt that's making it plume and puff up, or there's oxygen in the dirt that as you step on it and compress it, it shoots it out. There's no air. So as you step in it, it doesn't ruffle at all because there's nothing to
It just forms.
puff it. Yeah, there's nothing to shoot it out because you're not compressing anything into it.
You just blew my mind, man.
Yeah, so if you were to kick it, the momentum would carry it a little bit, but it would never plume up.
As much force as you're putting behind the particulate to force it in that direction.
Yeah. That to me was just absolutely incredible. And that's why those footprints are so defined, is because there's no outward pressure.
There's
It's
nothing
just
to
straight down.
degrade them or move that around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Aldrin goes ahead and joins Armstrong on the surface 12 minutes later. And they start beginning their test movement methods, which are pretty funny. But
Just footage of them like walking, like penguin walking, and then kind of like bouncing around and
like
kangaroo hop. Yeah.
Aldrin, the petty bitch that he was, said that as he was coming down the ladder, he actually pissed his suit.
So he was the first man to urinate on the moon.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. He wanted a first on the moon so bad that he just went ahead.
I need something that's going to get me drinks for the rest of my life in case being second on the moon isn't, impressive enough.
Whose first idea is that to do on the moon? Like, God, I got to think of something cool. Am I like the first guy to do a backflip on the moon? No, I'm just going to piss my suit.
Fucking Armstrong looks over and Aldrin's on his back. He's like, the fuck are you doing?
Either that or he looks back and Armstrong's
floating.
like, are you pissing in your suit, man? He's like, I'm peeing in my suit. Something kind of cool about the whole entire endeavor was after they had figured out this kind of walking pattern, they did just so many different things on the moon. One of the things that they had actually done was all of the pictures taken were mostly of Buzz Aldrin because Armstrong was the one with the camera. So unless they had ever I'm sure they switched at times. There's pictures of Armstrong, but he was the documenter. He was the guy that was supposed to go out and take all the pictures so they could see everything, while Aldrin was kind of somebody that was setting different things up. Some of the things that they had set up was they had planted an American flag straight down into the surface, as Chris talked about. Didn't go down real well, and the flag planting training was not successful.
So it goes in like 2 inches. And because there's no wind or anything like that, they get it to where it's balanced and they think it's going to stay in there. And if you've ever seen footage of like, or a picture of them with the flag, it looks like it's waving or ruffling. And this has been a huge conspiracy thing about like, there's no fucking air on the moon. It was shot in a hangar and all this shit. The flag, if you look at the top of it, there's a stick to keep the flag extended out. And then if you look down, the flag was literally just folded and like wadded up.
Yeah.
And when they were trying to unpack the shit, it's wrinkled. And that's why it's holding. The flag itself is supposed to be like somewhat rigid so it would stay sticking out.
Well, and not to mention there's zero gravity. So the actual force that would pull a flag taut and straight down isn't there. So if it's crumbled up, it's just going to stay in that position. They actually had to pull out the crumble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you have something that you have a hammer or a drill? You have a drill. Why aren't you just trying to drill in? And like, you would think it was such a big presentation thing to be able to plant the flag on the moon. You'd think there would be some backup planning to if the flag, a tripod, perhaps, because nothing's going to push it over.
Tripod's brilliant. Tripod's an easy fix. You don't even got to put it into the ground. Just extend some legs out.
Yep.
This is interesting to me because this was something that the United States did. The American flag was what was hung on the moon. They weren't laying claim to the moon.
USA.
Because somehow we had signed a treaty saying that nobody would try to take ownership of shit in space. Like that.
Yeah, this wasn't a Tom Cruise far and away situation that you plant the flag and you have ownership over it. We claim the moon.
Yep. But
that had to have been something like that. You just didn't hear that transmission that at one point, because of course there's footage that you don't see. What if it was like one of them carrying the moon out and you just see Aldrin plant it down? You hear it through his, he's like, I claim the moon for the United States. And like, yeah, we can't use that, Buzz. Just fucking hammer the stake in and just stand in front of it.
Take two. Along with that, they, again, planted the lunar flag poorly. And Dick Nixon sobered up enough to go ahead and give them a call. And when he called...
Am I talking to the moon? Holy shit. This is going to be the most expensive phone call. But yeah, he was like... he had an advisor there that was a former astronaut with him. And he had written out this huge thing that he wanted to say the night before. And the guy was like, you know what? Just keep it brief. Say a few words. You know, they're a long ways up there. They've only got a limited amount of time.
Busy.
And so he was just like, keep your yap closed as much as possible.
And this was probably the one call that Richard Nixon wanted to know or wanted to tell everybody was recorded in the White House. Along with that, they set up this thing called the retroreflector that was used for lunar laser ranging. And it was just an experiment that so many people have done. I think I had a friend or something like that who had a dad that was pretty into like space, and you can actually fire a laser from space and hit the mirror and it will come back at the speed of light. And because we know what the speed of light is, you can actually tell the exact distance.
Yeah, it's to within inches. We know the exact distance. And it's just this weird, it's not even super reflective, but it's a flat panel made of some reflective material and it's not big.
No.
The thing's like maybe a foot by a foot. Because they know the coordinates, you'd have to wait for exact timing and the correct conditions to be able to do that. But the fact that they're just like, yeah, just put this fucking shoebox on the moon and we'll just shoot some lasers at it and figure out how far this thing really is.
And it was just so basic and so primitive. What do you do if you're firing lasers at the moon and one day it's like 5 feet closer?
I'm not gonna lie. They probably do get differentiation.
Yeah, I wonder if they do get different readings, just closer, further away, anything like that.
So how long did they initially do that walk for?
They were out there for, you would think, not very long, or a lot longer just because of what they did. Along with that, when they put the reflector up, they had a passive seismic experiment package that was deployed, and it was to measure all of the earthquakes that would go on the moon.
Moonquakes. It's not Earth, Adam. It's the moon.
Yeah, I guess that's true, huh? This was a pretty cool plan. They had actually, something that I didn't think that they had back then, they put solar panels on it, so it actually had like early photovoltaics.
Yeah.
The issue was like 2 or 3 weeks after they had left, it actually burned out, and they believe it was because the solar panels got too hot.
Yeah.
And so they stopped getting readings. So they had this up there for like 3 weeks, and it's just this big clunky machine that's just sitting on the moon that doesn't work anymore. So they had that, retroreflectors. Armstrong walked over to one of the craters and was taking pictures. As he was doing that, Aldrin
Buzz.
collected. Huh?
I was going to say Buzz was over there going,
Can I push him in?
that's what I was going to say. No one would know. He fell. And
I
then,
can fly this thing back.
And then I'll be the sole survivor that landed on the moon first. I'll be number one.
I'll be the only guy that made it back. Aldrin collected 2 core samples just digging down. I'm sure that's when they found out that they couldn't go too deep when they were trying to plant the flag as to why that happened.
Yeah.
They collected a box of rocks and soil, which kind of a cool come up of all this. It's called armalcolite, and it was a mineral that was first discovered on the moon that was named after Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin. Later on, they ended up finding it on Earth. Okay. So
But did it already? I'm guessing it already had a name on Earth.
no,
Oh,
they
no?
had discovered it on Earth somewhere, and we're like, oh, well, that's the same stuff that was on the moon. But every sample and specimen that they brought back, as far as like a rock or a mineral or anything like that, is naturally occurring on Earth too.
Well,
So
you know the reason for that.
no.
Okay, so the moon.
If you're going to tell me that we were connected like some sort of Earth Pangea,
Long ago, the Earth was impacted, and chunks of the Earth flew away from it. There was enough gravity that over time, when the planet is unstable like that, it will reform into the same shape that the most efficient shape is a globe. It will reform into that. The moon is made from the same materials as the Earth, just without the with the absence of oxygen.
I got to believe you on that. How?
Because if you think about it from this perspective, it probably makes more sense. The moon is very big. It's compared to the Earth, it is, I think, 1/32. So anyway, if something ever got that close to the Earth,
Yeah.
nothing that big could get close enough to the Earth without being either pulled into it and destroyed,
Yeah.
or be going so fast that the Earth's gravity could catch it and pull it into an orbit. It would have to be moving slow enough to do that, to not just skip off the atmosphere or just destroy the planet. So the only way that it could have formed is by separating from Earth, and then that material that then separated and gathered. Because if you have an impact, it's going to launch material on a certain trajectory.
Yeah.
If enough of that material gathers together, when it does that over the billions of years, it will reform itself into the most efficient shape, because gravity is centered on the core, so everything then gets packed around it equally.
Okay. I think I'm with you now. Just because of the way you said that and the way that glass is made, that makes sense as to why the moon would have such a glassy surface, because as the sun's reflecting on it enough and it's heating up all the sediment that's come together, it's going to start to form kind of a glob.
So Earth is about 4 times wider than the moon. So I mean, it's not small like an asteroid would be. It would if something that big had been close enough to our planet, I believe it would have destroyed the planet.
Okay. I'm with you on that. Along with all that, I don't know, it's cool. I think it's kind of fun. There's some issues with it. But there was a plaque that was mounted on the ladder, and I think they took it off and left it there. It had an inscription on it. The inscription on it said, "Here men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind."
I like that. Simple, effective. I also like the fact they didn't put the exact date on it. They're just like, we'll be up there at some point in July.
Is that what stands out to you?
Do you want to read it again so I can pick something else out?
Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD.
Oh, yeah. Read about this. So, again, being men of science, there was some type of uproar that there wouldn't be any type of recognition of Christianity.
Because of the lawsuit from the assholes reading from Genesis.
Yes. That by ignoring that they were somehow... God, my mic keeps doing that. Excluding I guess I don't know. It makes no sense to me, so I don't know the terminology to use for it. But basically, it was put in there to placate a bunch of fucking religious bullshit.
Yep. AD, Annos Domini, in the year of our Lord. That's why we use CE and BCE now to take out the fact that we don't really understand where zero came from, and it probably wasn't.
Yeah, they still
Jesus.
get to have that be the linchpin moment.
Yeah.
They just don't get the naming on either side of it.
Yep. Part of this weird religious thing that was happening was Aldrin actually took sacrament on the lander before they left. He was some kind of like a Baptist minister or bishop or something like that, but just
Westboro Baptist Church.
yeah,
Fucking
maybe
snakes.
pretty close. Yeah, just
He came out of the lander with 2 snakes and started preaching.
a weird kind of caveat to this whole thing. But yeah, they had to put AD in there because Nixon had told them that they had to put AD in there because they needed to placate the Christians. But along with that, just setting this stuff down, that's kind of like, this is what we're going to do for them. There was also like it was like a bronze olive branch. Oh, and that's the other thing about AD. Any alien that shows up on the planet and sees, or shows up on the moon and sees that, they don't know what the fuck AD is. They have no
When
understanding.
we explain it to him, like, so what is this thing that you
Yeah.
guys put on each side of your number or on the side of your numbers? What is that? And I'm like, some people think this guy was born on that day. They're like, one guy? Like, was this the first guy on your planet? And we're like, no. People think that he's the son of a Sky Lord, and that he was sent down here to then be killed to absolve all of us of all the shit that we do. The alien would just look at you and be like, how did you guys get to the fucking moon?
What is it? You guys used to count time down.
I don't
and then you
believe
went
that there
back
were
up?
men here. I believe you guys just launched enough shit at the moon that something finally landed. I bet if I walk around here enough, I'll see a bunch of crashed stuff with different dates.
Yeah, just such a weird thing. But they also had kind of some pretty cool shit that they left as like an homage to what was going on.
Oh, I want to talk about this.
Yeah, and during this time, like Chris referenced earlier, Aldrin had spent an hour and 33 minutes on the surface. Armstrong had actually gotten a little bit of an extension because he was out taking pictures and doing some other things. He was out there for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Along with that plaque, I forgot to mention, there were also goodwill messages from the leaders of 73 other countries just put on the plaque. So it's like, oh, yeah, you know, Cambodia agrees.
It was on a disc.
Oh, that's what it was.
It was a disc that was recorded with all that information. Yeah.
So just
Like, that was just the style that anyone could read. Like, someone would come find the disc and be like, I know what this is. We still use these.
we can figure out what this means. We know what this language is they're speaking. As they were getting ready to take off, I think it was after. Well, this must have been prior to that because this was when Armstrong was getting on. Aldrin's like, "Hey, you forgot about the other bag that we had," and Armstrong's like, "Okay, well, I can't really go back out there." They're like, "Well, just dump it. We're taking off. It'll all be down there. Everything's gonna be okay." It was actually a patch from Apollo 1 with the 3 astronauts that had died that they had left there on the moon, which is probably the coolest thing that I can think of that you would leave.
Yeah, like the greatest homage.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So they did end up having to sleep on the moon.
Yeah.
So I think they did 2 walks, right?
I think they were both just out there the entire time.
Well, because I know, okay, maybe they had to sleep before they were going to launch themselves back up because the sleeping arrangements, they had to hang hammocks at like a crisscrossing pattern, like above one another to sleep, and still they said they couldn't fucking sleep. Going back to those, they were called PPKs, personal preference kits, and you were allowed a certain weight limit of stuff that you could bring with you on these missions. Armstrong, I think, had the coolest shit. So Armstrong had a piece of the Wright Flyer from 1903, a piece of the wood from the prop, and fabric from the canvas that they actually stretched over it that he took with him.
Pretty sweet.
There was an astronaut pin that had been given to Deke Slayton from all of the widows, the 3 widows from the Apollo 1 pilots, that they had made him a pin because he felt, horrible about it and everything. And so they took that pin up there with them. So just like that kind of shit, like just to take up there and being like, yeah, this shit's been on the moon. And they also brought back a shit ton of like lunar rocks. It was like, what, 200 plus pounds?
Yeah. Yeah. I forgot to mention too, in a sign of goodwill, and I'm sure, like, from me to you, they left 2 memorial medals for the 2 dead Russian cosmonauts that had died that we know of.
Yeah, two
during
of the ones that were
that made the news.
that we were able to like find out that they launched something and someone didn't come back. Some
that they couldn't
information
deny.
leaked out.
Yeah, so I mean, even though this is a U.S. mission, like the little nod to, hey, you guys gave your life to maybe not get to where we are, but helped us advance in a certain way.
Hey, buddy, you made it. You made it. Funny.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, funny fact about this point, too, is the Russians weren't in a position to get guys to the moon to beat us. So what they did instead is they just launched an unmanned probe that was supposed to kind of land roughly, not the same time, within a matter of days, but within a matter of hours, but within a few days, I think. They had to be notified because in all of that, the chances of them colliding or some shit like that, they had to be made aware there was something else in orbit or whatnot. But it was just kind of funny that they're like, we can't get men up there, but let's steal a little bit of the thunder that we can report in our papers and say that we also launched something up there too.
It actually crashed like 2 hours before
into like the side of a hill
the takeoff,
or something, right?
Shit.
Where he broke off I think that's what you were. So getting out of the lander.
Yeah.
So getting out of the lander, they almost broke the door because it was jammed. Getting back into the lander, because it takes a long time to squeeze in because you have that big, bulky backpack thing on.
Yeah.
And as Buzz is actually getting in there, he turns around too quick or does something and ends up damaging or snapping a switch off that armed the ascent engine to get them off the moon. Can you just imagine, like, he hits and he hears something, and he looks down, and he's like, uh-oh. And Armstrong's like, what do you mean, uh-oh? He's like, he's like, well, I hit this button right here, which we probably don't need that. And he's like, that's what fires the fucking rocket to get us back into orbit, you dipshit. It's like, well, there's got to be, like, is there a backup? Is there, like, a manual start, like a pull start that we can use for this? And so they had to call into Mission Control and be like, hey, Mission Control, you know that switch that we used to turn on the rocket to get us out of here? Yeah, someone bumped into it and broke it. Is there any way that we could actually get that thing to work? And they were walked through. There were contingencies for all this shit. And they were like, yeah, I guess just rewire it from this point to this point. You guys should be able to launch it.
That didn't work, though.
It didn't?
No. You don't know how this story ends?
I heard that they had just received instructions from Mission Control and they were able to reroute it from another circuit to activate it.
They pulled a felt tip pen.
Oh, that's right.
Out of the pocket of one of their spacesuits.
That's right.
And jammed the tip of the felt tip pen into the circuit breaker.
Because it was a non-conductive material.
Yes. And that was how they were able to launch.
That's fucking right.
39-cent pen is what helped get them back home. I remember what I blanked out on before. So they're bringing back all these rocks. They're bringing back a bunch of heavy material. Mm-hmm. The name of the game is to try to be as light as possible to make sure that this rocket launches you up there. So what do you got to do?
You got to start pitching shit,
Yep.
right?
So on the moon, both of their air units that they were wearing were tossed out to start cutting weight. Mm-hmm. And there's just a pile of shit that they didn't need to go back with.
All the tools that they had brought with them.
That are just laying on the moon because we
just
had
in that spot.
It's a pile of trash that we left along with all of these other mementos. That it's like, if that's not the most American shit ever to have like very sweet, like sentimental things.
And not far from it.
No.
Because they had to toss it out the fucking door.
Pile of trash.
You couldn't even hide it behind a boulder or anything like that. Like, just chuck it as far as you can away from it so they see the plaque but maybe don't see the crap.
Just incredible. So, after more than 21 hours, that's what it was. Yeah. So, we'll get to the 21 hours part. The ascent begins. The thrusters kick on. Thrusters pushing against the ground. That's going to create a lot of space that's being pushed out. And the thrusters blow the American flag over that they couldn't drill far enough.
Yeah, as like Buzz is sitting there like piloting and everything. I think, or as Neil was doing that, I think Buzz said he was looking down through one of like the lower windows so they could see the ground. And he's like, yeah, as we lifted off, he's like, I'm pretty sure it fell over. because they were close and everything. And as they're launching off, it's creating force because you're creating exhaust that's coming out.
Yep.
And that just hits the plant or hits the ground and then just goes out to the sides. And if they didn't have it in there very deep to begin with, can you imagine that? He's like, don't fucking tell me that.
Yeah, that just absolutely
So now
sucks.
I have to lie too for the rest of my fucking days.
Oh, and you mean everybody else that might come up here afterwards is going to see that the flag was knocked over? Mm-hmm. That's not a good look for us.
We didn't do it. Someone else must have been up there and knocked the flag over.
Aliens, man, I
Yeah.
don't know what to tell you. They end up clean takeoff. Everything goes well. The rendezvous with Collins goes very well.
Which to me, again, bonkers. The fact that, so he finds them, he knows where they're going to be at, so he knows when he's going to be passing over them. And at that point, he has to then kind of rotate again, slow himself down, because he then has to meet them coming up into orbit. They're just controlling it by the thrusters and everything on that thing. They get back into position, and just like that, boom, they dock.
Collins orbited the moon for more than 21 hours. Each orbit takes 2 hours, and for 48 minutes of that 2 hours, he has no contact with anybody.
So he can talk almost a little more than half the time.
Yeah, that is the kind of loneliness while being on edge that I can't really figure out. But Collins seems like he handled it well. This is a funny little anecdote at the end of this. On the return to Earth, there was a bearing at the Guam tracking station that failed, so the rotation in the satellite that picks up the comms for them, and it was potentially going to prevent comms on the whole last part of the return to Earth. Pretty big deal. They didn't have enough time to dispatch a crew to go out there and actually fix it. So the guy that was in charge of the station, his name was Charles Force, he was the station director, got his 10-year-old son Greg in his skinny little arms of a 10-year-old to reach into the machine and pack the bearings with enough grease for them to be able to spin it. So,
Kid's a fucking hero.
the reason that they made it back home with comms is because a 10-year-old was used for child labor to shove his small hand into something that could have ripped his entire arm off.
It's the American way.
Just to grease the bearings. I guess when they got home, Armstrong personally thanked Greg for packing the bearings.
Yeah, I would. After they actually connected in orbit, basically what they did is after they went back through the docking port, they unloaded everything for the samples that they needed. And then as soon as that was done, sealed the hatch, and then the lunar module was just detached from it.
Don't need it anymore.
Don't need it anymore.
Served its purpose.
Yep. They turn, fire up the rocket again, point it at the blue thing, and engage it, and head back again, 25,000 miles an hour, heading back for Earth. As they approach Earth, they detach the actual command module from the service module. It then turns to where they're all facing backwards, and they re-enter Earth's atmosphere. The stuff that the heat shield, because it's hitting the friction of the atmosphere at such high speed, that's what causes the intense heat and the glowing and everything. The stuff that the heat shield is made of is called ablative material, and instead of just resisting the heat and just basically cooking from the inside, the stuff actually kind of like sloughs off and burns off. So the material will get to a certain degree and then just burn off, and it takes the heat with it. So it's able to dissipate the heat until it gets to a point where it's low enough in the atmosphere where it's not essentially on fucking fire anymore.
Pretty smart.
Once they get down to a certain altitude, the thing at this point, it's a free-falling metal slug, is all it is. And as it hits a certain altitude and the sensors pick that up, it blasts the cap off the top of it and launches parachutes that pull out the huge parachutes, whatever they call those, pre-parachutes. It then engages the huge 3 parachutes, and as it's coming down into the water, it has this huge raft buoy basically around it that then basically engages, turning the thing into a raft. And then in case that fails and it starts sinking, it has these huge inflatable, looks like buoys on the top of it that would keep the thing from sinking completely. Once they get into Earth orbit and arrange, coming into the atmosphere and landing, the Navy is notified and are basically on station in the general area that they're going to be coming down. They have helicopters out there searching for them, and as soon as they catch sight, they actually dispatch its aircraft carrier.
Yep, USS Hornet.
The USS Hornet, baby, to go out and pick them up. After they send out the little boats to get them out, these guys are basically not allowed to interact. Well, they're allowed to interact, but they are taken from the capsule and walked directly into what I can only describe as a fancy Airstream trailer, which I'm pretty sure it was, and kept in there for how long?
3 whole weeks. The funny part about them landing is because we're concerned about space bugs and you don't know what they're bringing back. The whole time on the way back, Collins actually suited up himself for when they returned. Mm-hmm. They slept that night in those hammocks on the moon, still in their suits, because they were concerned about the debris and breathing it in from the moon. Turns out it's still just the same debris that they have down here, but we didn't know that at that point.
Could have brought back the moon flu.
Yep.
You ever had the moon flu, Adam?
As they land, they hit, and the USS Hornet is dispatched from Wake Island to go out there and get them. As they show up, like you were talking about, with the helicopters, they attach the helicopters to the capsule to make sure that there's not too much sway or anything like that, and it's not going to flip. The hatch is opened. The rescuers then throw in decontamination suits for the astronauts to put on. They get out. Everybody that's in the boats is in decontamination suits. We go ahead and bring them back to the boat, where when they get off, they're hit with delousing powder or whatever it is to clean them. And then if the astronauts hadn't done enough at that point, they turn around and clean up the rescuers to make sure that they didn't get any shit on them. And then, they're whisked away into this isolation for 3 weeks where they had to be monitored. They could still see their family, but it was through a pane of glass, like in prison.
There's pictures of them, like the three of them waving through the glass. Basically, they would bring this thing back, and then they're not going to spend 3 weeks on an aircraft carrier.
No.
So I think it would come back all the way close to Houston. And then they were actually brought, that was transportable to when that would be lifted off the aircraft carrier, and it would be shuttled to the Johnson Space Center, where they would spend the rest of the time. They would be debriefed, and that's where they would essentially start accounting for all of the samples that they got. They brought back, like, I think it was like 200, maybe 250 plus pounds of these fucking moon rocks. And there were like people in Congress that were like, well, we want moon rocks. Like, we want moon rocks to hand out to delegate. Can you imagine, like, you're the only people that have that? And imagine how badass that seems. It's like, here, I got you a gift. And they're like, it's a rock. And like, that's a piece of the moon, my friend. Like, seriously? It's like, yeah, I was able to get it for you. How about we make that treaty?
It's the Cuban cigar of the moon for the people in the United States.
Even more rare.
Yeah, they can't get a hold of them.
But yeah, reentry occurred on July 24th. So all in all, the mission took a total of 8 days. So yeah, 3 there, 2 on the moon, 3 back. Yeah. National fucking heroes did the whole tour, went to New York, did a worldwide tour. The guys, you still know their names today, except for fucking Michael Collins. Again, sorry, Mike. But yeah, I mean, these guys were fucking rock stars. And it didn't take long for NASA to be like, okay, we can do this shit. Let's keep doing it. And I think a total of 6 missions, 5 additional missions were sent to the moon.
4 of them landed?
No, there were 6 that were scheduled.
5 of them landed.
Yeah. Yeah, because Apollo 13 didn't.
Yeah.
Still got back. Spoiler alert. And each one kind of had its own, stayed a little bit longer each time, I think, for some of them. One of the cool things that happened during one of the missions, I can't remember which number it was, but the guy that was going up that knew he was going to be on the lunar surface had a custom, 6-iron head made.
Yeah.
And had it made to where it would attach to the end of a tool that he was going to have on the moon already. And he took a couple golf balls with him and went out and hit him. He said they went for miles. He's like, I hit him. But
I say the same thing.
Well, people that actually, like the scientists from NASA and everything, be like, actually, probably not. They would go further, but they would eventually, because of the angle and trajectory, the moon would bring them back down.
Well, just like my golf game again, you can attest. It doesn't go as far as it should.
That's true. That's very true. You can relate. But as far as, at that point, mankind's greatest accomplishment, we thought at that point that we were destined to just fucking keep going and conquering the stars. And for some reason, kind of after the Apollo missions, there was nothing to gain from it. I think at that point, the excitement had kind of worn off. People weren't willing to spend as much money into the space program as they had previously done. And man, after those missions, I think we've been back to the moon maybe once, maybe not even. But mankind's greatest moment.
Yeah.
America's greatest hit. If there's a number one greatest hit, it might be putting a man on the moon first, and then under that, maybe coming in helping with the world wars.
And so much of it, too, is, I kind of alluded to it earlier, it's the coolest thing that we've ever done, but it might be one of the most unnecessary things that we've ever done.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the fact that we hit the moon, and the next, it's like, well, what do we do? Next is Mars. Okay, well, it took us this much to get to the moon, and we're so much further away from Mars that there's no way we're going to be able to sink enough money into this to make it happen anytime soon.
They're the same way in that a Ferrari and a Pinto are both cars. They're both completely different things when you get into that category, getting to Mars. And we can't, at that point, we couldn't even really view Mars. We had no idea. How are you going to get, the moon had only been a place that we could go because we were able to like photograph it with other missions and telescopes and do all that kind of stuff. Mars, we would have no idea what was there.
Yeah.
That's why it was literally the point where like there could be fucking aliens there.
Yeah, I think we have some rovers and some other vehicles
Yeah.
on Mars now, but that's as close as we're gonna get anytime soon, I think. But I don't know. I think that, like we were talking about and agreed on, it's the coolest thing that we've ever done. I don't know if it was a flex against communism. We kind of joked about it in research that if this was the punch to communism, that a government funded organization by the people was the way that communism.
The only way that they were able to spin that capitalism was in there is because certain aspects of like the vehicles were designed and built by other companies. They were subcontracted to do that to see who could develop the best one. That's the only thing that they could point to as far as capitalism, because the rest of it was completely funded by the government.
Yeah, and these things weren't done pro bono.
Yeah.
They were capitalism because they were probably overcharged for it too.
Yeah, just an amazing moment in human history that I think just kind of looked at today. It doesn't get the shine that it deserves just because of everything that was necessary at that time for people just to come up with this without fucking a computer figuring it out for them, to do this manually to that group of women who sat behind those doors and weren't known about for so many years, that helped make this entire thing happen, and all the people that designed the fucking rockets, not the Nazis. But yeah, just 400,000 people at one point or another were working for this program. It's nuts.
And it almost blows me away that it really is what it is today.
We are at 2.5 hours on this, so hopefully you're still listening. And if any of you are listening that know anybody that participated in the Apollo program, and you could put us in touch with them just to ask them some questions, we would love to do that. Hit us up on our socials. They'll be at the end of the episode. Other than that, man, you got anything else?
Good. We're good here.
All right. Well, guys, thanks for joining us on another week. We'll catch you next time.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.